Welcome to another video on stories of our history. Imagine a king so powerful that he claimed the title of King of Kings, ruler of a vast empire stretching from the rivers of Mesopotamia to the mountains of Afghanistan. His armies had held the mighty Roman legions at bay for centuries, and his court was a center of wealth, culture, and learning. Now imagine that same king, stripped of his dignity, forced to kneel before a nomadic chieftain on the barren steppes of Central Asia. This was the fate of Peroz I, the Shah of the Sassanian Empire, and it was the result of a series of catastrophic military campaigns against a mysterious and terrifying enemy, the White Huns. Known to history as the Hephthalites, these warriors from the east emerged from the vastness of the steppes in the 4th and 5th centuries, and they quickly established themselves as one of the dominant powers of the ancient world. They were not like other nomadic confederations. They were organized, disciplined, and extraordinarily skilled in the arts of mounted warfare. From their heartlands in Bactria and Sogdiana, the land between the great Oxus and Jaxartes rivers, they launched raids and campaigns that struck fear into the hearts of settled peoples from the borders of China to the plains of India. For the Persian Empire, they were an existential threat, a force that could strike at the very core of the state and undermine its economic and political foundations. The wars between the Sassanians and the Hephthalites would span decades, culminating in one of the greatest military disasters in Persian history, the death of King Peroz I in 484 AD, and the humiliation of his once proud empire. This is the story of that conflict, the story of the terror from the east, and the story of how a proud king's ambition led to catastrophe. It is a story of shifting alliances, of brutal battles, and of the enduring struggle between the settled world and the nomadic frontier. It is a story that would shape the destiny of Persia, India, and all of Central Asia, and its echoes can still be felt in the geopolitics of the region today. The tale of Peroz and the White Huns is not just a story of ancient warfare. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating an enemy and the price of imperial overreach. The Sassanian Empire, which Peroz I ruled, was the successor to the ancient Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great and Darius I. Refounded in 224 AD by Ardashir I, the Sassanian dynasty had restored Persian power and created a state that rivaled the Roman Empire in the west. The Sassanians saw themselves as the heirs of a glorious tradition, the protectors of Iranian culture and the Zoroastrian religion. Their kings bore the title Shahanshah, King of Kings, and they ruled over a diverse population of Persians, Parthians, Medes, and many other peoples. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by a powerful noble or a member of the royal family. The military was dominated by the heavy cavalry, the cataphracts, who were armored from head to toe and were the shock troops of the ancient world. The economy was based on agriculture, trade, and the control of the vital routes of the Silk Road. The Sassanian Empire was a sophisticated and complex state, but it was also a state that was constantly at war. Its western frontier was a perpetual battleground against the Romans and later the Byzantines, while its eastern frontier was a source of constant vigilance against the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. The Sassanian kings had to be both warriors and administrators, capable of leading armies in the field and managing the complex affairs of state. The pressure on the frontiers was immense, and the resources of the empire were constantly stretched thin. It was into this world of perpetual crisis that Peroz I was born, and it was this world that would shape his destiny and ultimately lead him to his doom. The Sassanian Empire, for all its power and glory, was a fragile thing, dependent on the skill and wisdom of its rulers. A weak king could bring the empire to the brink of ruin, while a strong king could restore its fortunes. The challenge posed by the Hephthalites would test the very limits of the Sassanian state, and it would reveal both the strengths and the weaknesses of this ancient superpower. The Hephthalites themselves are a mysterious and fascinating people. Their origins are obscure, and scholars still debate their exact relationship to other nomadic groups such as the Xiongnu and the Huns of Europe. The name, White Huns, was given to them by Byzantine historians, perhaps because of their lighter skin compared to other steppe peoples, or perhaps because of some other distinguishing characteristic. Chinese sources call them the Yeda or Yanda, while Persian sources use the term Hephthal or Hephthal. The Hephthalites did not leave behind any written records of their own, so our knowledge of them comes from the accounts of their enemies and their neighbors. From these sources, we can piece together a picture of a powerful and sophisticated confederation. They were not simply a horde of savage barbarians. They had a complex political structure, with a king at its head and a hierarchy of nobles and chieftains. They practiced a form of polygamy, and they engaged in the practice of cranial deformation, binding the heads of their infants to create elongated skulls, a mark of beauty and social status. They were skilled metalworkers, and their coins, which imitated Persian and Indian models, are a testament to their economic sophistication. Their military power was based on the horse. The Hephthalites were master horsemen, raised in the saddle from childhood. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at a full gallop, and they were skilled in the use of the sword and the lance. Their cavalry was highly mobile, capable of striking quickly and then disappearing into the vastness of the steppe. This mobility was their greatest weapon, and it was a weapon that the slow-moving armies of the settled empires found difficult to counter. The Hephthalites were also skilled in the use of terrain, using the deserts and mountains of Central Asia to their advantage. They were masters of the ambush, the feigned retreat, and the long, exhausting campaign that sapped the strength of their enemies. The Hephthalite Empire, at its height, stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River, and it was a major force in the politics of the ancient world. Their rise to power would shatter the existing balance of power and usher in a new era of conflict and instability. The rise of the Hephthalites was closely linked to the decline of the Kushan Empire, which had ruled over Bactria and northern India for centuries. By the 4th century, the Kushan Empire was in a state of decay, its power weakened by internal divisions and external pressures. The Sassanians had already conquered parts of the Kushan realm, establishing their own provinces in Bactria and Gandhara. But the collapse of Kushan power also created a vacuum, and into this vacuum stepped the Hephthalites. They moved into Bactria, the land of the ancient Oxus River, and they made it their own. Bactria was a rich and fertile region, a crossroads of trade and culture. It was the perfect base for a nomadic empire, providing pasture for their horses and access to the wealth of the Silk Road. From Bactria, the Hephthalites were able to project their power in all directions. They raided the Sassanian provinces of Khorasan and Transoxiana. They threatened the trade routes that connected Persia to China. And they cast their eyes southward, towards the rich and prosperous lands of India. The rise of the Hephthalites was a geopolitical earthquake, and its tremors were felt from the Mediterranean to the Ganges. The Sassanian Empire, which had considered itself the dominant power in the region, suddenly found itself facing a new and formidable enemy on its eastern frontier. This enemy was not like the others. It was more mobile, more aggressive, and more resilient than any foe the Persians had faced before. The stage was set for a conflict that would define the history of the region for decades to come. The Hephthalites, the terror from the east, were here to stay, and the kings of Persia would have to learn to deal with them, or perish. The geographical setting of this epic struggle is crucial to understanding its course. The eastern frontier of the Sassanian Empire was a vast and unforgiving region, dominated by deserts, mountains, and steppes. The province of Khorasan, which corresponds roughly to modern northeastern Iran, parts of Turkmenistan, and northern Afghanistan, was the key to the defense of the empire. It was a region of great strategic importance, for it controlled the main routes between Persia, Central Asia, and India. The city of Merv, in modern Turkmenistan, was a major center of trade and administration, and it was a crucial staging point for military campaigns. Beyond Khorasan lay the lands of the steppes, the home of the nomadic peoples. The Amu Darya, known to the Greeks as the Oxus, was the great river that separated the settled world from the steppe. Crossing the Amu Darya was a major undertaking, and it was a line that the Sassanians struggled to defend. To the north lay the vast expanse of the Kizilkum and Karakum deserts, the red sand, and black sand, where only the most skilled and knowledgeable guides could survive. To the south lay the Hindu Kush Mountains, a formidable barrier that separated Central Asia from the Indian subcontinent. The Hephthalites, who were masters of this harsh environment, used it to their advantage. They knew the location of every waterhole, every mountain pass, and every ford across the rivers. They could move their armies quickly and secretly, striking where the Persians least expected them. The Sassanians, for their part, were often operating at the limits of their logistical capabilities. Their armies, composed of heavy cavalry and infantry, were slow-moving and required vast amounts of supplies. The further they advanced into Hephthalite territory, the more vulnerable they became. The geography of the region was a weapon, and the Hephthalites wielded it with deadly skill. The wars between Persia and the Hephthalites were not just battles of men, they were battles against the land itself, and the land often proved to be the more formidable enemy. The harsh climate, the scarce water, and the vast distances all took their toll on the Persian armies, weakening them before they even encountered the enemy. The Hephthalites, who were born and raised in this environment, were perfectly adapted to it, and this adaptation was a key factor in their success. The early relationship between the Sassanians and the Hephthalites was not always hostile. In fact, there were periods of peace and even alliance between the two powers. The first recorded contact between the two peoples occurred during the reign of Bahram V, who ruled from 420 to 438 AD. Bahram V, known as Bahramgar, was one of the most famous and beloved of the Sassanian kings. He was a legendary hunter, a great warrior, and a patron of the arts. According to the sources, Bahramgar personally led a campaign against the Hephthalites, who had invaded Khorasan. He defeated them in a decisive battle, killing their king and capturing vast amounts of booty. The victory was celebrated throughout the empire, and Bahramgar's reputation was secured. However, the victory was not decisive enough to eliminate the Hephthalite threat. They remained a presence on the eastern frontier, and they continued to pose a challenge to the Sassanian state. The successors of Bahramgar, Yazdijir II and Peroz I, would have to deal with this challenge on a more sustained basis. The reign of Yazdijir II, from 438 to 457 AD, was marked by constant warfare on both the eastern and western frontiers. Yazdijir II fought against the Romans in the west and against the Hephthalites in the east. He achieved some successes, but he was unable to secure a lasting peace. The pressure on the empire was immense, and the king was forced to spend much of his reign in the field, leading his armies from one campaign to the next. The constant warfare took a toll on the empire, draining its treasury and exhausting its manpower. The stage was being set for the great crisis of the late 5th century, when the Hephthalites would inflict a series of humiliating defeats on the Persian Empire, culminating in the death of Peroz I. The early alliance and conflict between the two powers would prove to be a prelude to a much larger and more destructive war, a war that would shake the very foundations of the Sassanian state. The history of the relationship between Persia and the Hephthalites is a complex one, full of twists and turns, of alliances made and broken, of victories won and defeats suffered. It is a story that reveals the fluid and unpredictable nature of politics on the ancient steppe frontier, where friends could become enemies overnight, and where the balance of power was constantly shifting. The reign of Peroz I, which began in 459 AD, was marked by a succession crisis that would have fateful consequences for the empire. Peroz was not the eldest son of Yazdijir II, and his claim to the throne was contested. The legitimate heir was his brother, Hormuzd III, who had been appointed as viceroy of the eastern provinces. When Yazdijir II died, Hormuzd III proclaimed himself king, but Peroz, who was in the east at the time, refused to accept his brother's authority. The empire was plunged into a civil war, with the two brothers fighting for control of the throne. Peroz, who was at a disadvantage, sought help from an unlikely source, the Hephthalites. He made an alliance with the Hephthalite king, whose name is given in some sources as Akshanwar, and he promised to cede territory and pay tribute in exchange for military support. The Hephthalites, who were always eager to profit from the internal divisions of their neighbors, agreed to help. With the support of the Hephthalite cavalry, Peroz was able to defeat his brother Hormuzd and seize the throne. Peroz was now the king of kings, but he had paid a heavy price for his crown. He was indebted to the Hephthalites, and they would not let him forget it. The alliance that had brought Peroz to power would soon turn into a source of conflict. The Hephthalites, who had been promised territory and tribute, began to press their claims. Peroz, who was now secure on his throne, was reluctant to fulfill his promises. He saw the Hephthalites as a threat to his authority, and he sought to assert his independence. The relationship between the two powers, which had been based on mutual convenience, quickly deteriorated into hostility. The Hephthalites, feeling betrayed, began to raid the Persian frontier, and Perez, determined to assert his authority, prepared for war. The civil war that had brought Perez to power had weakened the empire, and had created a dangerous dependency on the Hephthalites. The new king, who owed his throne to the nomads, was now determined to break free from their influence. But he would soon discover that the Hephthalites were not an enemy to be taken lightly. The stage was set for a series of catastrophic wars that would bring the Persian Empire to the brink of ruin. The alliance between Perez and the Hephthalites was a classic example of the dangers of making deals with the devil, and it was a mistake that would cost the king and his empire dearly. The first military campaign of Perez against the Hephthalites was a disaster. Perez, eager to assert his authority and to free himself from his obligations to his former allies, led a large army into Hephthalite territory. The exact date of this campaign is uncertain, but it probably occurred in the early years of his reign, perhaps around 460 or 461 AD. The Persian army advanced into the arid lands beyond the Amu Darya, searching for the Hephthalite forces. The Hephthalites, however, were not interested in a pitched battle. They understood the weaknesses of the Persian army, and they used their mobility to their advantage. They retreated before the Persian advance, drawing the Sassanian forces deeper and deeper into the desert. The Persians, confident in their numerical superiority, pursued the elusive enemy, but they soon found themselves in a desperate situation. The Hephthalites had led them into a waterless region, where there was no shelter from the scorching sun and no water for the men and horses. The Persian army, which was burdened by its heavy equipment and its large baggage train, began to suffer terribly. Thirst and exhaustion took their toll, and the army's morale collapsed. The Hephthalites, who had been watching from a distance, now closed in for the kill. The Persians, weakened and demoralized, were in no condition to fight. Perez was forced to negotiate a humiliating surrender. He was compelled to prostrate himself before the Hephthalite king, to acknowledge Hephthalite overlordship, and to promise to pay a heavy annual tribute. He was also forced to swear an oath that he would never again attack the Hephthalites. The first campaign against the Hephthalites had ended in total defeat. The King of Kings had been humbled, and the prestige of the Sassanian Empire had been shattered. The news of the defeat sent shockwaves through the empire, and it emboldened the enemies of the Sassanians on all fronts. The Hephthalites, who had been a regional nuisance, were now a major power, and they were determined to assert their dominance over the Persian Empire. The first defeat of Perez was a turning point, a moment when the balance of power in Central Asia shifted decisively in favor of the Hephthalites. The king had learned a harsh lesson about the dangers of underestimating the nomadic warriors of the steppe, but it was a lesson that he would not fully internalize. The first campaign was a disaster, but it would not be the last. The humiliation of the first defeat did not deter Perez. The king, who had been forced to kneel before his enemy, was determined to avenge his shame and to restore the honor of the Sassanian Empire. He spent the next few years rebuilding his army and preparing for a second campaign against the Hephthalites. The annual tribute, which was a heavy burden on the empire's finances, was a constant reminder of his humiliation, and Perez was determined to free himself from this obligation. The Hephthalites, for their part, were aware of Perez's preparations, and they were ready for him. The second campaign, which probably took place around 464 or 465 AD, was a repeat of the first. Perez led a large army into Hephthalite territory, confident that this time he would achieve victory. But the Hephthalites, once again, refused to give him the pitched battle he desired. They used the same tactics that had brought them success before, retreating before the Persian advance and drawing the Sassanian forces into the desert. Perez, who was determined not to repeat his previous mistake, tried to be more cautious, but he was still outmaneuvered by the mobile Hephthalite cavalry. The Persian army, once again, found itself lost in the arid wilderness, suffering from thirst and exhaustion. The Hephthalites, who had been shadowing the Persian forces, now attacked. The Persian army, weakened and demoralized, was unable to put up effective resistance. Peroz was forced to retreat, but the retreat turned into a rout. The Hephthalites pursued the fleeing Persians, inflicting heavy casualties. Peroz himself narrowly escaped capture, but his army was shattered. The second campaign was an even greater disaster than the first. The king had not only failed to avenge his earlier defeat, but he had also lost a significant portion of his army and had further weakened his position. The tribute to the Hephthalites was now even more burdensome, and the prestige of the Sassanian Empire was at an all-time low. The Hephthalites, who had now defeated the Persian king twice, were the undisputed masters of the eastern frontier. Peroz, who had started his reign with such promise, was now a broken man, his authority challenged, his empire weakened, and his reputation in tatters. The second defeat was a catastrophe, but it was only a prelude to the final, fatal campaign that would claim the king's life and plunge the empire into chaos. The third and final campaign of Peroz against the Hephthalites was the most catastrophic of all. It took place in 484 AD, and it ended with the death of the king and the destruction of his army. The exact circumstances of the campaign are described in several sources, with varying details, but the basic outline is clear. Peroz, who had spent years preparing for this final effort, assembled the largest army he could muster. He was determined to crush the Hephthalites once and for all and to erase the shame of his previous defeats. The Hephthalites, who were aware of Peroz's preparations, chose the battlefield. They selected a site on the border of their territory, near the city of Balkh, in what is now northern Afghanistan. They prepared a trap. According to the sources, the Hephthalites dug a massive ditch, or a series of ditches, across the battlefield. The ditch was wide and deep, and it was hidden by a covering of branches and earth. The Hephthalite army then positioned itself on the far side of the ditch, offering battle. Peroz, who was eager to engage the enemy, ordered his cavalry to charge. The Persian cataphracts, the pride of the Sassanian army, thundered across the plain, their armor gleaming in the sun. But as they approached the Hephthalite lines, the ground gave way beneath them. The hidden ditch swallowed the Persian cavalry, horses and riders tumbling into the trench. The Hephthalites, who had been waiting for this moment, now launched a devastating counterattack. They rained arrows down on the trapped Persians, and then they charged with their own cavalry, slaughtering the helpless soldiers. The Persian army, its vanguard destroyed and its formation shattered, was thrown into confusion. The Hephthalites pressed their advantage, and the battle turned into a massacre. Peroz himself was killed in the fighting, along with many of his sons and his most trusted generals. The Persian army was annihilated, and the survivors, including Peroz's son Kavad, were taken prisoner. The disaster of 484 was one of the worst defeats in the entire history of the Sassanian Empire. The king was dead, the army was destroyed, and the empire was left defenseless before its enemies. The Hephthalites, who had defeated the Persian king 3 times, were now the dominant power in the region. The catastrophe of 484 was a turning point in the history of the ancient world, a moment when the power of the Sassanian Empire was shattered, and a new era of chaos and uncertainty began. The death of Peroz I was a tragedy, but it was also a symptom of a deeper crisis, a crisis that had been building for decades and that would now explode with full force. The aftermath of the disaster of 484 was a period of profound crisis for the Sassanian Empire. The death of the king and the destruction of the army had left the state vulnerable on all fronts. The Hephthalites, who had emerged victorious from the war, were quick to exploit their advantage. They invaded the eastern provinces of the empire, sacking cities and carrying off vast amounts of plunder. The rich province of Khorasan, which had been the scene of so much fighting, was devastated. The Hephthalites imposed a heavy tribute on the empire, and they effectively reduced the Sassanians to the status of a vassal state. The proud kings of Persia, who had once claimed to rule the world, were now forced to pay homage to a nomadic chieftain. The political situation was equally chaotic. The death of Peroz had left a power vacuum, and the empire was thrown into a civil war as various members of the royal family and the nobility vied for control of the throne. The immediate successor of Perez was his brother, Balash, who was able to secure the throne with the support of the nobility and the clergy. Balash, however, was a weak and ineffectual ruler, and he was unable to restore the fortunes of the empire. He was forced to accept the Hephthalite terms, and he struggled to maintain order in the face of internal dissent and external pressure. The reign of Balash was a period of stagnation and decline, as the empire struggled to recover from the shock of the Hephthalite victory. The disaster of 484 had exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the Sassanian state, its over-reliance on the person of the king, its vulnerability to attack from the east, and its inability to cope with the mobile warfare of the nomadic peoples. The empire had been humiliated, and it would take decades of reform and recovery before it could once again assert its power. The period following the death of Perez was one of the darkest in the history of the Sassanian Empire, a time when the very survival of the state was in question. The Hephthalites, who had brought the mighty Persian Empire to its knees, were now the masters of Central Asia, and they would remain a major power for decades to come. The disaster of 484 was a catastrophe, but it was also a catalyst for change, forcing the Persians to rethink their military strategies and to reorganize their state in order to meet the challenges of the future. The captivity of Kavad I, the son of Perez, is a poignant symbol of the Sassanian Empire's humiliation. Kavad, who had fought alongside his father in the disastrous campaign of 484, was taken prisoner by the Hephthalites. He was held as a hostage, a guarantee of the Persian Empire's good behavior. The young prince, who had witnessed the death of his father and the destruction of his army, was now forced to live as a guest, or perhaps a prisoner, in the court of the Hephthalite king. The experience of captivity would have a profound impact on Kavad. He would learn the ways of the Hephthalites, their strengths and their weaknesses, and he would come to understand the challenges of ruling a vast empire. The period of Kavad's captivity was also a time of great turmoil within the Persian Empire. The weak rule of Balash failed to address the empire's problems, and discontent grew among the nobility and the common people. It was during this time that a new religious and social movement emerged, led by a charismatic figure named Mazdak. Mazdak preached a message of radical egalitarianism, calling for the redistribution of wealth and the sharing of property. His teachings, which were a direct challenge to the established order, resonated with the poor and the oppressed, and the movement quickly gained a large following. The Mazdakite movement, which was both a religious and a social revolution, posed a serious threat to the power of the nobility and the clergy. The empire, already weakened by external defeat, was now threatened by internal revolution. It was in this context of crisis that Kavad, who had been released from Hephthalite captivity, or perhaps had escaped, made his bid for the throne. Kavad, who had learned from his experiences, was determined to restore the power of the monarchy and to address the problems that had brought the empire to the brink of ruin. He would prove to be a more capable and ruthless ruler than his father, but he would also face challenges that were even greater than those that had confronted Perez. The period of Kavad's captivity and the rise of the Mazdakite movement were turning points in the history of the Sassanian Empire, moments when the old order was challenged and a new era began. The legacy of the disaster of 484 was not just military defeat and political chaos. It was also a social and religious upheaval that would transform the very fabric of Persian society. To fully understand the catastrophe of the Hephthalite Wars, we must delve deeper into the nature of the Hephthalite state and its military machine. The Hephthalites were not a simple horde, they were a sophisticated and organized confederation, capable of administering a vast territory and conducting complex military operations. Their state, which was centered in Bactria and Sogdiana, was a major power in Central Asia, and it was recognized as such by the other great empires of the age. The Hephthalite king, who bore the title of Hephthalite, or King of the Hephthalites, was the supreme ruler, and his authority was absolute. He was surrounded by a court of nobles and officials, who helped him to govern the realm. The Hephthalites had a written language, which was adapted from the Greek alphabet, and they minted their own coins, which were used in trade throughout the region. Their economy was based on agriculture, trade, and the tribute that they extracted from their neighbors. The Hephthalites controlled the important trade routes of the Silk Road, and they taxed the caravans that passed through their territory. This trade brought them great wealth, and it allowed them to maintain a large and well-equipped army. The Hephthalite army was one of the most formidable military forces of its time. Its core was the cavalry, which was composed of skilled horsemen armed with bows, swords, and lances. The Hephthalite cavalry was famous for its mobility and its endurance. They could cover vast distances quickly, and they could fight effectively in a variety of terrains, from the open steppe to the rugged mountains. They were also skilled in the use of combined arms, coordinating the actions of cavalry, infantry, and siege engines. The Hephthalites were not just raiders, they were capable of conducting sustained military campaigns, capturing fortified cities, and defeating the armies of the great empires. Their military success was due to a combination of factors: their skill as horsemen, their knowledge of the terrain, their tactical flexibility, and their willingness to adapt to new circumstances. They were a formidable enemy, and the Sassanians, who had been accustomed to fighting the relatively static armies of the Romans, were ill-prepared to deal with them. The Hephthalites were the masters of mobile warfare, and they used this mastery to devastating effect against the slow-moving armies of the Persian Empire. The military system of the Hephthalites was a product of their nomadic origins, but it had been refined and adapted to the conditions of settled warfare. They were a hybrid force, combining the mobility of the steppe with the organization of a settled state, and this hybridity was the secret of their success. The tactical genius of the Hephthalites was demonstrated most clearly in their use of the feigned retreat and the ambush. These were classic steppe tactics, perfected by centuries of warfare against both settled and nomadic enemies. The feigned retreat was a simple but effective maneuver. The Hephthalite cavalry would advance against the enemy, engage in a brief skirmish, and then turn and retreat, pretending to flee in panic. The enemy, believing that the Hephthalites were beaten, would pursue them, often breaking formation in their eagerness to catch the fleeing horsemen. The Hephthalites, who were expert horsemen, would maintain their discipline and cohesion even in retreat, drawing the enemy further and further into a trap. When the enemy had been sufficiently strung out and exhausted, the Hephthalites would turn and attack, often with a hidden force that had been waiting in ambush. The ambush was another favorite tactic. The Hephthalites would conceal their forces in a valley, a ravine, or behind a hill, and then lure the enemy into the killing zone. Once the enemy was fully committed, the Hephthalites would spring the trap, attacking from all sides and cutting the enemy to pieces. The disaster of 484, which we have already described, was a perfect example of the Hephthalites' use of the ambush. The hidden ditch was a variation on the classic ambush, a way of trapping the enemy cavalry and destroying the cohesion of the enemy army. The Hephthalites were also skilled in the use of psychological warfare. They would mutilate their enemies, displaying their severed heads on poles, or they would use other forms of intimidation to break the enemy's will to fight. Their reputation for cruelty and ruthlessness was a weapon in itself, and it often caused their enemies to flee in terror. The Hephthalites were not just brave warriors, they were cunning tacticians, and their mastery of the art of war was a key factor in their success. The Sassanian generals, who were trained in the more formal and rigid tactics of the settled world, were often outmaneuvered and outthought by the Hephthalite commanders. The war between Persia and the Hephthalites was a clash of military cultures, and it was a clash that the Persians, at least initially, lost decisively. The Hephthalites were the masters of the steppe, and they used their mastery to humble the proudest empire of the ancient world. The economic impact of the Hephthalite wars on the Sassanian Empire was devastating. The wars were fought primarily on the eastern frontier, in the province of Khorasan, which was one of the richest and most productive regions of the empire. The constant fighting, the raids, and the invasions destroyed crops, disrupted trade, and caused widespread depopulation. The tribute payments that the Sassanians were forced to make to the Hephthalites were a massive drain on the imperial treasury. The gold and silver that flowed eastward to the Hephthalite court was money that could have been used to pay soldiers, build roads, or support the arts. The economic strain of the wars exacerbated the social tensions within the empire. The burden of taxation fell heavily on the peasantry, who were already struggling to survive. The nobility, who were exempt from many taxes, were reluctant to contribute to the war effort, and they often used the crisis to increase their own power and wealth. The economic crisis also led to a decline in the value of the currency, as the government was forced to debase the coinage in order to meet its expenses. The inflation that resulted from this debasement further impoverished the common people. The economic impact of the Hephthalite Wars was not just a matter of numbers, it was a matter of human suffering. The wars caused untold misery for the people of the eastern provinces, who were forced to endure the horrors of invasion, occupation, and exploitation. The farms were burned, the villages were looted, and the people were killed or enslaved. The economic and social fabric of the region was torn apart, and it would take generations to recover. The Hephthalite Wars were a catastrophe for the Sassanian Empire, not just because they resulted in military defeat and political humiliation, but because they caused a profound economic and social crisis that undermined the very foundations of the state. The empire, which had been a beacon of prosperity and stability, was now a shadow of its former self, struggling to survive in a world that had become much more dangerous and uncertain. The economic legacy of the Hephthalite Wars would be felt for decades, and it would play a major role in the subsequent history of the Sassanian Empire. The crisis of the late 5th century was a direct result of the economic and social dislocation caused by the wars, and it was a crisis that would ultimately transform the very nature of the Persian state. The religious and social upheaval of the Mazdakite movement was directly connected to the crisis caused by the Hephthalite Wars. The wars had exposed the weaknesses of the Sassanian state, and had created a sense of disillusionment and despair among the common people. The old order, which had been based on the authority of the king, the nobility, and the Zoroastrian clergy, seemed to have failed. The people were looking for answers, and Mazdak provided them. Mazdak preached a message of radical egalitarianism and social justice. He called for the redistribution of wealth, the sharing of property, and the abolition of the rigid social hierarchy that had long been a feature of Persian society. His teachings, which were a direct challenge to the power of the nobility and the clergy, resonated with the poor and the oppressed, and the movement quickly gained a massive following. The Mazdakite movement was not just a religious sect, it was a social revolution, a challenge to the very foundations of the Sassanian state. The king, Kavad I, who had come to the throne in the midst of this crisis, initially supported the Mazdakite movement, perhaps as a way of weakening the power of the nobility and strengthening his own authority. Kavad, who had seen the weaknesses of the old order firsthand, may have believed that radical reform was necessary to save the empire. However, the Mazdakite movement soon became too radical for even Kavad to control. The Mazdakites began to seize the property of the rich and the powerful, and they threatened the stability of the state. The nobility and the clergy, who were the main targets of the Mazdakite movement, fought back, and the empire was plunged into a bloody civil war. The Mazdakite movement was eventually suppressed, but not before it had caused immense damage to the social and political fabric of the empire. The connection between the Hephthalite Wars and the Mazdakite movement is clear. The wars had weakened the state, discredited the old order, and created a fertile ground for radical ideas. The Mazdakite movement was a symptom of the crisis, a response to the suffering and the injustice that the wars had caused. It was a sign that the old order was failing, and that a new order was struggling to be born. The story of the Mazdakite movement is a reminder that military defeat can have profound social and political consequences, and that the seeds of revolution are often sown in the aftermath of catastrophe. The Sassanian Empire, which had been humbled by the Hephthalites, was now threatened by its own people, and it would take a strong and ruthless ruler to restore order and stability. The diplomatic landscape of Central Asia in the 5th century was a complex web of shifting alliances and competing interests. The Sassanian Empire was not the only power that was threatened by the Hephthalites. The Gupta Empire of India, which was then at the height of its power, also faced the Hephthalite onslaught. The Hephthalites, who had established their dominance over Bactria and Gandhara, were now pressing southward, into the rich and fertile plains of northern India. The Gupta emperors, who had built a vast and prosperous empire, were forced to defend their northern frontier against this new threat. The Hephthalite invasions of India were as devastating as their wars against Persia, and they contributed to the decline of the Gupta Empire. The Chinese, who were also concerned about the rise of the Hephthalites, maintained diplomatic contacts with both the Sassanians and the Hephthalites, playing one against the other. The Chinese, who had their own history of conflict with nomadic peoples, understood the danger posed by the Hephthalites, and they sought to prevent them from becoming too powerful. The diplomatic relations between these great powers were complex and often contradictory. Alliances were made and broken, treaties were signed and ignored, and the balance of power was constantly shifting. The Sassanians, who had initially allied with the Hephthalites against their own rivals, now found themselves at war with their former allies. The Hephthalites, who had been a minor power, were now a major player in the geopolitics of the region. The Chinese, who were far away, were nevertheless deeply involved in the politics of Central Asia, using their diplomatic and economic influence to shape the course of events. The diplomatic landscape of Central Asia in the 5th century was a dangerous and unpredictable place, and the rulers of the great empires had to be skilled diplomats, as well as skilled warriors. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is not just a story of battles and sieges. It is also a story of diplomacy, of alliances, and of the complex interactions between the great powers of the ancient world. The Sassanian Empire, which had been a dominant power for centuries, was now forced to navigate a world that had become much more complex and dangerous. The Hephthalites, who had emerged from the steppes, were now at the center of this world, and their actions would shape the destiny of the region for decades to come. The diplomatic history of the Hephthalite Wars is a fascinating and complex subject, and it is a subject that is essential to understanding the full significance of this conflict. The sources for the history of the Hephthalites are fragmentary and often contradictory. We have no written records from the Hephthalites themselves, so we must rely on the accounts of their enemies and their neighbors. The Byzantine historians, such as Procopius and Agathias, provide valuable information about the Hephthalites, but they are often biased and unreliable. The Persian sources, such as the Shahnameh and the works of the Islamic historians, also provide important information, but they are often mixed with legend and myth. The Chinese sources, which are often the most detailed and accurate, provide a wealth of information about the Hephthalites and their relations with China. The Indian sources, such as the Puranas and the accounts of the Chinese pilgrims, provide information about the Hephthalite invasions of India. The archaeological evidence, including coins, inscriptions, and the remains of settlements, also provides important clues. Piecing together the history of the Hephthalites is like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with many missing pieces. The picture that emerges is incomplete and often contradictory. Nevertheless, scholars have been able to reconstruct a general outline of Hephthalite history, and they have been able to identify the major events and the major personalities. The Hephthalites, who were once considered to be a minor and obscure people, are now recognized as one of the major players in the history of the ancient world. Their wars against the Sassanian Empire and the Gupta Empire were major events, with far-reaching consequences. The study of the Hephthalites is an ongoing process, and new discoveries are constantly being made. The archaeological work in Central Asia, in particular, is shedding new light on the Hephthalite civilization. The more we learn about the Hephthalites, the more we realize how important they were, and the more we appreciate the complexity of the ancient world. The sources for the history of the Hephthalites may be fragmentary, but they are sufficient to allow us to understand the basic outlines of their story, and to appreciate the significance of their impact on the history of Asia. The story of the White Huns is a story that is still being written, and it is a story that deserves to be told. The reign of Kavad I, the son of Peroz, was a period of profound transformation for the Sassanian Empire. Kavad, who had witnessed the disasters of his father's reign and had spent time as a hostage in the Hephthalite court, was determined to restore the power of the monarchy and to address the problems that had brought the empire to the brink of ruin. He was a complex and contradictory figure, a reformer who was also a ruthless tyrant, a visionary who was also a pragmatist. His reign, which lasted from 488 to 531 AD with a brief interruption, was one of the most important in the history of the Sassanian dynasty. Kavid's early years on the throne were marked by the continuation of the crisis. The empire was still reeling from the shock of the Hephthalite victory, and the Mazdakite movement was gaining strength. Kavad, who was initially sympathetic to the Mazdakites, saw them as a potential ally in his struggle against the nobility and the clergy. He may have genuinely believed in the principles of social justice that Mazdak preached, or he may have simply seen the movement as a useful tool for weakening his enemies. Whatever his motivations, Kavid's support for the Mazdakites was a bold and risky move. It alienated the powerful noble families and the Zoroastrian clergy, who were the pillars of the traditional order. The result was a backlash. The nobles and the clergy, who had been sidelined by Kavid's reforms, conspired against him. In 496 AD, they deposed Kavad and imprisoned him in the Castle of Oblivion in Khuzestan. Kavid's brother, Jamasp, was placed on the throne. The deposition of Kavad was a major setback for the reformist cause, but it was not the end of the story. Kavad, who was a resourceful and determined man, managed to escape from prison, with the help of his sister, his wife, and a loyal general. He fled to the Hephthalites, his former captors, and he sought their help to regain his throne. The Hephthalites, who were always eager to interfere in the internal affairs of the Persian Empire, agreed to help. In 498 or 499 AD, Kavad returned to Persia with a Hephthalite army, and he quickly defeated his brother and regained his throne. The restoration of Kavad was a triumph for the king, but it came at a price. He was now deeply indebted to the Hephthalites, and he was forced to cede territory and pay tribute. The Hephthalites, who had been the enemies of his father, were now his patrons, and the cycle of dependency continued. The reign of Kavad I was a period of constant struggle, as the king fought to maintain his authority in the face of internal opposition and external pressure. His experiences, both as a prisoner and as an exile, had taught him the importance of power and the ruthlessness that was necessary to maintain it. The story of Kavad's rise and fall and rise again is one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of the Sassanian Empire, and it is a story that illustrates the complex relationship between the Persian Empire and its nomadic neighbors. The reforms of Kavad I were a direct response to the crisis caused by the Hephthalite wars and the Mazdakite movement. Kavad recognized that the old system, which was based on the power of the great noble families and the Zoroastrian clergy, was no longer working. The empire needed a strong central government, a loyal army, and a more equitable distribution of wealth. Kavad set about implementing a series of reforms that would achieve these goals. The most important of these reforms was the overhaul of the tax system. The old system, which was based on a chaotic and unfair system of land grants and tax exemptions, was replaced by a new system, based on a comprehensive survey of the land and a fixed rate of taxation. This reform, which was carried out under the direction of Kavad's son and successor, Khosrow I, would transform the finances of the empire. It would provide the government with a reliable source of revenue, and it would reduce the power of the nobles, who had been the main beneficiaries of the old system. Kavad also reformed the army. The old army, which was based on the feudal levies of the nobility, was unreliable and inefficient. Kavad created a new standing army, paid directly by the crown. This army, which was composed of professional soldiers, was more loyal and more effective than the old feudal levies. The creation of a standing army was a major step towards the centralization of power, and it would be a key factor in the military successes of the later Sassanian kings. Kavad also promoted religious and social reform. He initially supported the Mazdakite movement, but he later turned against it, recognizing that its radical egalitarianism was a threat to the stability of the state. The suppression of the Mazdakite movement was a bloody affair, but it was necessary to restore order. The reforms of Kavad I laid the foundation for the revival of the Sassanian Empire. They addressed the root causes of the crisis, and they created the conditions for a new period of strength and prosperity. The reforms were continued and expanded by his son, Khosrow I, who would become known as Anushirvan, of the immortal soul, one of the greatest of all the Sassanian kings. The crisis of the late 5th century, which had been caused by the Hephthalite Wars, had ultimately led to a process of reform that would transform the Sassanian state and prepare it for a new era of greatness. The story of Cavid's reforms is a story of institutional innovation, of political will, and of the capacity of even the most troubled states to renew themselves. The relationship between the Sassanian Empire and the Hephthalites during the reign of Kavad I was complex and often tense. Kavad, who had been restored to the throne with Hephthalite help, was initially a client of the Hephthalite king. He was forced to pay tribute and to acknowledge Hephthalite overlordship. But Kavad was not content to remain a vassal. He chafed under the Hephthalite yoke, and he sought to regain the full independence of the Persian Empire. The death of the powerful Hephthalite king, whose name is not clearly recorded, provided Kavad with an opportunity. The Hephthalite Empire, which had been held together by the personality of its king, began to fragment. Internal disputes and succession struggles weakened the Hephthalites, and Kavad was able to exploit these divisions. He reduced the tribute payments, and he began to assert Persian authority on the eastern frontier. The relationship between the two powers, which had been one of patron and client, was now one of near equals. Kavad's son and successor, Khosrow I, would go even further. He would form an alliance with the rising power of the Turkic Khaganate, and he would launch a final, decisive war against the Hephthalites that would destroy their empire once and for all. The reign of Kavad I was a period of transition in the relationship between Persia and the Hephthalites. It was a time when the balance of power was beginning to shift, when the Sassanians were beginning to recover their strength, and when the Hephthalites were beginning to decline. The seeds of the Hephthalite destruction were sown during the reign of Kavad I, and they would bear fruit under his son. The story of Kavad's relationship with the Hephthalites is a story of gradual emancipation, of the slow and painful process of freeing the empire from the dominance of its nomadic neighbors. It was a process that required patience, skill, and a willingness to use both force and diplomacy. Kavad, who had learned from the mistakes of his father, was a master of this game. He knew when to appease the Hephthalites and when to defy them, and he was able to navigate the treacherous waters of Central Asian politics with considerable skill. The legacy of Kavad I is a complex one. He was a reformer, a tyrant, and a survivor. He was a king who had been deposed and restored, a king who had been a prisoner and in exile. His reign was a time of crisis and transformation, and it laid the foundation for the golden age of the Sassanian Empire under his son, Khosrow I. The story of Kavad I is an essential part of the story of the Hephthalite Wars, and it is a story that deserves to be told. The reign of Kavad I also saw a resurgence of warfare with the Byzantine Empire in the west. The crisis caused by the Hephthalite Wars had forced the Sassanians to neglect their western frontier, and the Byzantines had taken advantage of this to make gains. The Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I, who ruled from 491 to 518 AD, had refused to pay the subsidies that the Sassanians had come to expect, and he had fortified the eastern frontier of the Byzantine Empire. This was a direct challenge to Sassanian authority, and it was a challenge that Kavad could not ignore. In 502 AD, Kavad launched a major invasion of Byzantine territory. The war, which lasted until 506 AD, was fought with great ferocity. Kavad's armies captured the important fortress of Amida, and they devastated large parts of eastern Anatolia. The Byzantines, who were taken by surprise, were able to regroup and counterattack, but they were unable to dislodge the Sassanians. The war ended in a negotiated peace, with the Byzantines agreeing to pay a subsidy to the Sassanians. The war with the Byzantines was a major drain on the resources of both empires, but it was particularly costly for the Sassanians, who were still recovering from the catastrophe of the Hephthalite Wars. The renewed warfare with Byzantium was a sign that the Sassanian Empire was once again able to project its power on the world stage. It was also a sign of the continuing rivalry between the two great empires, a rivalry that would last for centuries and would ultimately weaken both of them. The reign of Kavad I, which had begun in crisis and had continued with civil war and reform, ended with the empire once again at war with its ancient enemy. The fact that Kavad was able to fight a major war against the Byzantines while still dealing with the Hephthalite threat is a testament to his ability as a ruler and to the resilience of the Sassanian state. The war with Byzantium was not just a military conflict, it was also a diplomatic struggle. Kavad, who was now free from the threat of his brother, was able to focus his attention on the west. He was determined to restore the prestige of the Sassanian Empire, and he saw the Byzantines as the main obstacle to this goal. The war with Byzantium, which was fought during a period of Hephthalite weakness, was a sign that the balance of power in the region was shifting. The Sassanians, who had been humbled by the Hephthalites, were now reasserting their dominance, and the Byzantines were their first target. The story of Kavad's reign is a story of recovery, of a king who was able to save his empire from the brink of ruin and to set it on a path towards renewed greatness. The legacy of Kavad I is a mixed one. He was a king who was both loved and hated, a reformer who was also a tyrant. His reign was a time of great upheaval and great achievement. He saved the Sassanian Empire from the chaos that followed the death of his father, and he laid the foundations for the golden age of his son. But he was also responsible for the suppression of the Mazdakite movement, which was a bloody and brutal affair. He was a king who was willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals, and he was not afraid to shed blood. The story of Kavad I is a reminder that history is not always a story of heroes and villains. It is often a story of complex and contradictory figures, who are driven by a mixture of ambition, idealism, and fear. Kavad I was such a figure. He was a king who had seen the worst that the world had to offer, and he was determined to survive and to make his empire strong. He was a survivor, and his story is one of the most remarkable in the history of the ancient world. The reign of Kavad I is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and to the capacity of even the most troubled states to renew themselves. The reforms that he initiated, which were continued by his son, would transform the Sassanian Empire and would make it one of the most powerful states of the ancient world. The wars that he fought, both against the Hephthalites and against the Byzantines, were a reminder of the constant challenges that faced the rulers of the ancient world. The story of Kavad I is an essential part of the story of the Hephthalite Wars, and it is a story that deserves to be remembered. The king who had been a hostage, an exile, and a prisoner, had become the savior of his empire, and his legacy would endure for centuries. The period of Kavad's reign was a bridge between the crisis of the late 5th century and the golden age of the 6th century, and it was a bridge that was built by a king who was willing to do whatever it took to ensure the survival of his dynasty and his empire. The reign of Kavad I was a time of transition, a time when the old order was crumbling and a new order was being born, and the king was at the center of this transformation, guiding his empire through the storm towards a brighter future. The rise of Khosrow I Anushirvan, the son of Kavad I, marked the beginning of a new era for the Sassanian Empire. Khosrow, who is often considered to be the greatest of all the Sassanian kings, reigned from 531 to 579 AD. He was a reformer, a builder, a patron of learning, and a brilliant military strategist. His reign was a golden age for Persia, a time of prosperity, stability, and cultural achievement. Khosrow inherited an empire that had been transformed by the reforms of his father, and he built upon this foundation to create a state that was more powerful and more centralized than ever before. The first great challenge of Khosrow's reign was the continuing threat of the Hephthalites. Although the Hephthalite Empire had been weakened by internal divisions, it was still a major power in Central Asia, and it continued to pose a threat to the Persian frontier. Khosrow recognized that the Hephthalites could not be defeated by Persia alone. They were too strong, and the Persian army, despite its reforms, was not well suited to fighting the mobile cavalry of the steppes. Khosrow therefore sought to forge a grand alliance with the rising power of the Turkic Khaganate. The Turks, who had recently emerged as a major force in Central Asia, were also enemies of the Hephthalites. They were eager to expand their territory and to control the trade routes of the Silk Road. A common enemy made the Persians and the Turks natural allies. Khosrow and the Turkic Khagan, who is known in the sources as Sinjabu or Silzabul, agreed to a joint campaign against the Hephthalites. The alliance was a masterstroke of diplomacy, and it would prove to be the key to the destruction of the Hephthalite Empire. The story of Khosrow's alliance with the Turks is a classic example of the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It was a pragmatic and effective strategy, and it was a strategy that would have far-reaching consequences for the history of Central Asia. The destruction of the Hephthalites would create a new balance of power, one that would be dominated by the Persians and the Turks, and it would set the stage for a new era of conflict and cooperation between these two great powers. The alliance between the Sassanian Empire and the Turkic Khaganate was a landmark event in the history of the ancient world. It was the first time that a major settled empire had forged a successful alliance with a major nomadic power against a common enemy. The agreement, which was sealed by a marriage alliance between Khosrow and the daughter of the Turkic Khagan, was a model of diplomatic cooperation. The two powers agreed to coordinate their military operations, with the Turks attacking the Hephthalites from the north and the Sassanians attacking from the west. The Hephthalites, who were caught between two powerful enemies, were unable to defend their territory. The campaign against the Hephthalites was swift and decisive. The exact dates are uncertain, but it is generally agreed that the war took place between 558 and 561 AD. The combined forces of the Persians and the Turks advanced into Hephthalite territory, capturing the key cities and defeating the Hephthalite armies. The decisive battle took place near the city of Bokhara, in what is now Uzbekistan. The Hephthalite army was annihilated, and the Hephthalite king was killed. The Hephthalite Empire, which had dominated Central Asia for over a century, was destroyed. The territory of the Hephthalites was divided between the victors. The Sassanians took control of the region south of the Amu Darya, including the important cities of Balkh and Herat. The Turks took control of the region north of the river, including the heartland of the Hephthalite Empire in Sogdiana. The destruction of the Hephthalite Empire was a major event in world history. It removed a major power from the map of Asia, and it created a new balance of power. The Sassanian Empire, which had been humbled by the Hephthalites, had now avenged its defeat and had restored its prestige. The Turkic Khaganate, which had been a rising power, had now become the dominant force in Central Asia. The destruction of the Hephthalites was a triumph for Khosrow I, but it was also a victory that would create new problems. The Turks, who had been allies, would soon become rivals, and the Sassanian Empire would find itself facing a new threat from the steppes. The story of the destruction of the Hephthalites is a story of the shifting alliances of the ancient world, a world where friends could become enemies overnight, and where the balance of power was constantly changing. The military reforms of Khosrow I were a crucial factor in the success of the Sassanian Empire against the Hephthalites. Khosrow recognized that the old feudal system, which had been based on the power of the great noble families, was inefficient and unreliable. He set about creating a new, professional army, paid directly by the crown. This army was divided into 4 main corps, each stationed in a different part of the empire. The most important of these corps was stationed on the eastern frontier, facing the threat from the steppes. The new army was equipped with the best weapons and armor, and it was trained to fight in a variety of conditions. Khosrow also reformed the military command structure, creating a clear chain of command and promoting officers based on merit rather than birth. The reforms of Khosrow transformed the Sassanian military into a more effective and more professional force. The new army was able to defeat the Hephthalites, and it would later prove its worth in the wars against the Byzantines. The military reforms of Khosrow were part of a broader program of administrative and fiscal reform. Khosrow overhauled the tax system, creating a more efficient and equitable system of taxation. He also reformed the government, creating a more centralized and bureaucratic administration. These reforms strengthened the power of the monarchy and reduced the power of the nobility. They also provided the government with the resources necessary to maintain a strong army and to fund public works. The reforms of Khosrow were a direct response to the crisis of the late 5th century. The Hephthalite wars had exposed the weaknesses of the old system, and Khosrow was determined to create a new system that would be more resilient and more effective. The reforms of Khosrow were a success, and they laid the foundation for the golden age of the Sassanian Empire. The empire, which had been on the brink of collapse, was now one of the strongest and most prosperous states in the world. The reforms of Khosrow were a testament to the power of good government, and they were a model that would be emulated by later rulers. The story of Khosrow's reforms is a story of institutional innovation, of political will, and of the capacity of a determined ruler to transform his state. The reforms were not just a response to the Hephthalite threat, they were a proactive attempt to create a better and more just society, and they were a major factor in the success of the Sassanian Empire in the decades that followed. The consequences of the destruction of the Hephthalite Empire were complex and far-reaching. The immediate result was the elimination of a major threat to the Sassanian frontier. The eastern provinces, which had been subjected to decades of raids and invasions, were finally at peace. The trade routes of the Silk Road, which had been disrupted by the wars, were reopened, and commerce flourished. The Sassanian Empire, which had been weakened by the Hephthalite wars, was now able to recover its strength and to prosper. But the destruction of the Hephthalites also created a new set of problems. The Turkic Khaganate, which had been the ally of the Sassanians, now became the dominant power in Central Asia. The Turks, who were a nomadic people like the Hephthalites, were just as ambitious and just as aggressive. They began to expand their territory, and they soon came into conflict with the Sassanians. The alliance that had destroyed the Hephthalites quickly turned into a rivalry. The Sassanians, who had hoped to secure their eastern frontier, now found themselves facing a new and potentially more dangerous enemy. The Turkic threat would preoccupy the Sassanian kings for centuries, and it would be a major factor in the eventual decline of the empire. The destruction of the Hephthalites also had consequences for India. The Hephthalite principalities in India, which had been established by Toramana and Mihirakula, were weakened by the fall of the Hephthalite Empire. However, they did not disappear entirely. Some of them continued to exist, and they were eventually absorbed into the emerging Rajput kingdoms. The legacy of the Hephthalites in India is complex and controversial. They are often portrayed as destructive invaders, but they also contributed to the cultural and political development of the region. The destruction of the Hephthalite Empire was a turning point in the history of Asia, but it was not the end of the story. The Hephthalites, who had been the terror of the East, were replaced by the Turks, who would become the new terror. The cycle of nomadic invasion and imperial response would continue, and the settled empires of Asia would continue to struggle to defend their frontiers. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that the balance of power in Central Asia was always fragile, and that the threat from the steppes was a constant feature of the ancient world. The victory of Khosrow I over the Hephthalites was a great achievement, but it was not a permanent solution. The struggle against the nomads would continue, and it would shape the destiny of Asia for centuries to come. The reign of Khosrow I was a golden age for the Sassanian Empire. The empire was at peace, the economy was booming, and the arts and sciences flourished. Khosrow was a great patron of learning, and he welcomed scholars from all over the world to his court. The Academy of Gunshaper, which had been founded centuries earlier, became one of the most important centers of learning in the world. Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac scholars worked together, translating texts and advancing knowledge in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. The game of chess, which had been introduced to Persia during the reign of Khosrow, became a popular pastime at court. The legendary sage Buzurjmir, who was said to be Khosrow's chief minister, was credited with deciphering the game and inventing backgammon. The reign of Khosrow was also a time of great building projects. The king commissioned the construction of magnificent palaces, bridges, and fortifications. The Great Wall of Gorgan, which was built to defend the eastern frontier against the nomads, was one of the most impressive engineering feats of the ancient world. The reign of Khosrow I was a time of peace and prosperity, a time when the Sassanian Empire was at the height of its power and influence. The contrast with the disastrous reign of Peroz, Khosrow's grandfather, could not be greater. Peroz had led his empire to ruin, while Khosrow had led it to greatness. The story of the transition from Peroz to Khosrow is a story of redemption, of how a state that had been humbled by its enemies could rise again, stronger than before. The Hephthalite Wars, which had brought the Sassanian Empire to the brink of collapse, had also been the catalyst for the reforms that would make the empire great again. The disaster of 484 was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. It forced the Persians to confront their weaknesses and to change their ways. The result was the Golden Age of Khosrow I, a period of achievement that would be remembered for centuries. The legacy of Khosrow I is a testament to the power of reform and to the resilience of the Sassanian state. The king who had destroyed the Hephthalites and built a golden age for his people was a fitting successor to his father, Kavad, and a worthy descendant of the great kings of the Sassanian dynasty. The story of Khosrow I is a story of triumph over adversity, and it is a story that deserves to be remembered. The fall of the Hephthalites Empire did not mean the end of the Hephthalite people. Many Hephthalites were absorbed into the Turkic Khaganate, while others remained in their ancestral lands, preserving their language and their culture. Some Hephthalite principalities continued to exist in the mountainous regions of the Hindu Kush, and they played a role in the subsequent history of the region. The Hephthalites are mentioned in the sources for centuries after the fall of their empire, and their descendants may have contributed to the formation of the Pashtun people of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The story of the Hephthalites is not just a story of war and destruction, it is also a story of survival and adaptation. The Hephthalites, who had once been the terror of the East, eventually disappeared as a distinct people, but their legacy lived on in the cultures and the peoples of Central Asia. Their DNA may still be present in the populations of the region, and their customs and traditions may have been passed down through the generations. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that even the most powerful empires are ephemeral, and that the peoples who inhabit the earth are constantly changing and evolving. The Hephthalites were once the masters of a vast empire, but they were eventually conquered and absorbed by others. Their story is a cautionary tale about the transience of power, but it is also a story about the resilience of the human spirit. The Hephthalites, who had emerged from the steppes to conquer much of Asia, eventually returned to obscurity, but their memory lives on in the historical record and in the archaeological remains of their civilization. The study of the Hephthalites is a reminder that history is not just the story of the victors. It is also the story of the vanquished, and it is a story that is always incomplete. The Hephthalites may have been forgotten for centuries, but they are now being rediscovered by scholars, and their story is being told to a new generation. The legacy of the Hephthalites is a complex one, but it is a legacy that is an important part of the history of Asia. The White Huns, who once struck terror into the hearts of their enemies, are now the subject of scholarly inquiry and historical fascination, and their story is a reminder of the rich and complex tapestry of the human past. The Hephthalite invasions of India were as devastating as their wars against Persia, and they had a profound impact on the history of the subcontinent. The Hephthalites, known in Indian sources as the Hunas, began to raid the northern frontiers of the Gupta Empire in the late 5th century. The Gupta Empire, which had been the dominant power in India for centuries, was already in decline, weakened by internal divisions and economic difficulties. The Hephthalite invasions accelerated this decline and contributed to the eventual collapse of the empire. The first major Hephthalite invasion of India occurred during the reign of the Gupta Emperor Skandagupta, who ruled from approximately 455 to 467 AD. Skandagupta, who is often considered to be the last of the great Gupta emperors, was able to repel the Hephthalite invasion. He celebrated his victory with a series of inscriptions and coins, which proclaim his triumph over the Hunas. The victory of Skandagupta was a temporary reprieve. The Hephthalites, who were persistent and determined, returned to the attack. After the death of Skandagupta, the Gupta Empire began to disintegrate. The later Gupta emperors were weak and ineffectual, and they were unable to defend the northern frontier. The Hephthalites, taking advantage of the chaos, invaded in force. They conquered the region of Gandhara, in what is now northern Pakistan, and they established their capital at the city of Sakala, which is now Sialkot. The Hephthalite conquest of Gandhara was a major blow to the Gupta Empire, and it opened the way for further invasions. The Hephthalites, who were now masters of the northwest, began to raid deeper into India, plundering cities and terrorizing the population. The Hephthalite invasions were a major factor in the collapse of the Gupta Empire, and they led to a period of political fragmentation and instability in northern India. The story of the Hephthalite invasions of India is a story of destruction and chaos. But it is also a story of cultural exchange and transformation. The Hephthalites, who were a nomadic people, were gradually assimilated into Indian society, and they contributed to the formation of the Rajput clans, who would play a major role in the subsequent history of India. The Hephthalite chieftain Toramana was one of the most powerful and successful of the Huna leaders in India. He is known from a number of inscriptions, which record his conquests and his grants to religious institutions. Toramana ruled over a vast territory in northern India, stretching from the Punjab to the Ganges Valley. He was a formidable warrior, and he was able to defeat the armies of the Gupta Empire and to establish his authority over a large part of the subcontinent. The capital of Toramana's kingdom was at Sakala, but he also controlled other important cities, such as Aran in Madhya Pradesh. The inscriptions of Toramana provide valuable information about the nature of Huna rule in India. They show that the Hunas were not simply destructive invaders. They were also patrons of religion and culture. Toramana made grants to Hindu temples and Buddhist monasteries, and he adopted many of the customs and institutions of Indian society. The Hunas, who were originally from Central Asia, were gradually being absorbed into the rich and complex culture of India. The reign of Toramana was the high point of Huna power in India. His son and successor, Mihirakula, would prove to be a far more controversial and destructive figure. Mihirakula, whose name means the destroyer, is portrayed in the sources as a cruel and fanatical tyrant. He is said to have persecuted Buddhists, destroyed monasteries, and delighted in acts of cruelty. The reign of Mihirakula was a time of terror for the people of northern India. However, Mihirakula's cruelty eventually provoked a backlash. A coalition of Indian kings, led by the Alakara king Yashodharman and the Gupta king Narasimhagupta Baladidya, rose up against the Hunas. In a great battle, which probably took place around 528 AD, the Indian coalition defeated Mihirakula and drove him out of the Ganges Valley. Mihirakula retreated to Kashmir, where he continued to rule for a time, but his power was broken. The defeat of Mihirakula marked the beginning of the end of Huna power in India. The Huna principalities, which had once dominated the north, were gradually absorbed into the emerging Rajput kingdoms. The story of Toramana and Mihirakula is a story of the rise and fall of a foreign dynasty in India. It is a story of conquest and assimilation, of cruelty and resistance, and of the enduring power of Indian culture to absorb and transform its conquerors. The reign of Mihirakula is one of the most controversial episodes in the history of ancient India. The sources, which are mostly Buddhist and therefore hostile to him, portray him as a monster, a persecutor of the faith, and a destroyer of civilization. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who traveled through India in the 7th century, recorded the legends of Mihirakula's cruelty. He wrote that Mihirakula was a wicked king who took pleasure in killing, and that he destroyed thousands of Buddhist monasteries and killed countless monks. The historian Kalhana, who wrote a history of Kashmir in the 12th century, also recorded the story of Mihirakula, adding further details of his cruelty and his persecution of Buddhists. The image of Mihirakula that emerges from these sources is one of a tyrannical and bloodthirsty barbarian, a man who was the enemy of all that was good and civilized. However, it is important to remember that these sources are biased. They were written by people who had suffered under Huna rule, and they had every reason to exaggerate the cruelty of their former oppressors. The historical Mihirakula may have been a ruthless conqueror, but he was probably not the monster that the sources make him out to be. He was a warrior king, who was determined to maintain his power and to expand his territory. His persecution of Buddhists may have been motivated by political considerations, rather than by simple religious fanaticism. The Buddhists, who were a powerful and wealthy community, may have been seen as a threat to Huna authority. Whatever the truth about Mihirakula, his reign represents a dark chapter in the history of India. The Huna invasions, which had begun under Toramana, reached their peak of destructiveness under Mihirakula. The wars and the persecutions of this period caused immense suffering and contributed to the decline of the Gupta Empire and the fragmentation of northern India. The story of Mihirakula is a reminder that the history of India, like the history of all great civilizations, is not just a story of peace and prosperity. It is also a story of war, conquest, and suffering. The Hunas, who were one of the many foreign peoples to invade India, left a lasting mark on the subcontinent, and their story is an essential part of the complex tapestry of Indian history. The memory of Mihirakula, the destroyer, has been preserved for over a millennium, a testament to the trauma of the Huna invasions and the enduring power of historical memory. The impact of the Huna invasions on the Gupta Empire was devastating. The Gupta Empire, which had been one of the most powerful and prosperous empires in the ancient world, was already in decline by the time of the Huna invasions. The empire had been weakened by internal divisions, by the growing power of the provincial governors, and by the economic difficulties caused by the disruption of trade. The Huna invasions accelerated this process of decline. The repeated attacks on the northern frontier drained the resources of the empire and undermined its authority. The loss of Gandhara and the other western provinces deprived the empire of a major source of revenue. The constant warfare and the resulting insecurity disrupted trade and agriculture, leading to economic decline. The Gupta Empire, which had once exercised control over a vast territory, gradually shrank to a small kingdom centered on the region of Magadha. The later Gupta emperors, who ruled in the 6th and 7th centuries, were weak and ineffectual figures, unable to restore the fortunes of their dynasty. The final collapse of the Gupta Empire came in the 6th century, when the empire was overrun by a series of invasions and internal revolts. The Huna invasions were not the only cause of the Gupta decline, but they were a major contributing factor. They weakened the empire and created the conditions for its eventual collapse. The fall of the Gupta Empire was a major event in the history of India. It marked the end of a golden age of Indian civilization, a period of great achievements in art, literature, science, and philosophy. The fall of the Gupta Empire also led to a period of political fragmentation, as the subcontinent was divided into a number of smaller kingdoms. This period of fragmentation would last for centuries, and it would shape the subsequent history of India. The Huna invasions, which were a major factor in the decline of the Gupta Empire, were a turning point in the history of the subcontinent. They marked the end of the classical age of Indian civilization and the beginning of a new era of political and cultural transformation. The story of the Huna invasions is a story of destruction and decline, but it is also a story of change and adaptation. The Hunas, who were a foreign people, were gradually absorbed into Indian society, and they contributed to the formation of the Rajput clans, who would play a major role in the subsequent history of India. The fall of the Gupta Empire was a tragedy, but it was also a necessary step in the evolution of Indian civilization. The cultural and religious impact of the Huna invasions on India was complex and multifaceted. The Hunas, who were originally from Central Asia, brought with them their own customs and traditions, which were gradually assimilated into the rich and diverse culture of India. The Hunas were not, as they are sometimes portrayed, simply destructive barbarians. They were also patrons of art and learning, and they contributed to the development of Indian culture. The Huna rulers, such as Toramana, made grants to Hindu temples and Buddhist monasteries, and they patronized Indian scholars and artists. The Hunas also adopted many of the customs and institutions of Indian society, including the caste system and the Hindu religion. Over time, the Hunas were completely absorbed into Indian society, and they became one of the many peoples who have contributed to the rich tapestry of Indian culture. The Huna invasions also had a negative impact on Buddhism. The Huna king Mihirakula, as we have seen, was a persecutor of Buddhists, and his reign was a time of great suffering for the Buddhist community. The persecution of Buddhists under Mihirakula dealt a severe blow to the Buddhist religion in India, and it contributed to its eventual decline. Buddhism, which had once been a major force in India, was gradually replaced by Hinduism, and the Huna persecutions were one of the factors in this shift. The Huna invasions also led to the displacement of populations and the disruption of trade. The constant warfare and the resulting insecurity forced many people to flee their homes, and the disruption of trade led to economic decline. The Huna invasions were a traumatic event in the history of India, and their impact was felt for centuries. The cultural and religious changes that they brought about were profound, and they helped to shape the character of Indian civilization in the centuries that followed. The story of the Huna invasions is a reminder that the history of India is not just a story of continuity and stability. It is also a story of change, disruption, and the constant interaction between different cultures. The Hunas, who were one of the many foreign peoples to invade India, left their mark on the subcontinent, and their story is an essential part of the complex and fascinating history of India. The legacy of the Huna invasions in India is still debated by historians. Some historians see the Hunas as a purely destructive force, whose invasions brought about the collapse of the Gupta Empire and a dark age of violence and chaos. Others see the Hunas as a more complex phenomenon, arguing that they also contributed to the cultural and political development of India. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. The Huna invasions were undoubtedly destructive, and they caused immense suffering. But they also brought about changes that were not entirely negative. The fall of the Gupta Empire, which was hastened by the Huna invasions, led to the emergence of new political formations, including the Rajput kingdoms, which would play a major role in the subsequent history of India. The assimilation of the Hunas into Indian society enriched the cultural and genetic diversity of the subcontinent. The Huna invasions also stimulated the development of new military technologies and tactics, as the Indian kingdoms sought to defend themselves against the nomadic threat. The legacy of the Huna invasions is a complex one, and it is a legacy that is still being debated by scholars. The study of the Hunas is a reminder that history is not a simple story of good versus evil, but a complex and nuanced narrative, full of contradictions and ambiguities. The Hunas were both destroyers and builders, both oppressors and assimilators. They were a force for change, and their impact on India was profound and lasting. The story of the Huna invasions is an essential part of the history of India, and it is a story that deserves to be told with nuance and sophistication. The Hunas, who were once the terror of the East, are now the subject of scholarly inquiry, and their story is a reminder of the complex and often brutal interactions between the settled world and the nomadic frontier. The legacy of the Huna invasions in India is a reminder that the past is never simple, and that the forces that shape history are often complex and contradictory. The story of the Hunas is a story that continues to fascinate and to challenge us, and it is a story that is still being written. The alliance between the Sassanian Empire and the Turkic Khaganate, which had been so successful in destroying the Hephthalite Empire, was not destined to last. The two powers, which had been united by a common enemy, soon found themselves at odds. The Turkic Khaganate, which had become the dominant power in Central Asia, was eager to expand its territory and to control the trade routes of the Silk Road. The Sassanian Empire, which had secured its eastern frontier, was determined to maintain its own influence in the region. The rivalry between the two powers was aggravated by a number of factors. The Turks, who were a nomadic people, were suspicious of the settled, urban civilization of the Persians. The Persians, for their part, looked down on the Turks as uncivilized barbarians. The economic competition between the two powers was also a source of tension. Both the Persians and the Turks wanted to control the lucrative trade in silk, which was one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. The Persians, who had traditionally been the middlemen in the silk trade, were determined to maintain their monopoly. The Turks, who now controlled the land routes through Central Asia, wanted to bypass the Persians and sell their silk directly to the Byzantines. The rivalry between the Persians and the Turks was a classic example of the clash between a settled empire and a nomadic confederation. It was a rivalry that would last for centuries, and it would be a major factor in the decline of both powers. The destruction of the Hephthalites, which had seemed like a great victory for the Sassanians, had simply replaced one enemy with another. The Turkic Khaganate, which was now the dominant power in Central Asia, was a new and even more formidable threat. The Sassanian kings, who had spent so much effort to secure their eastern frontier, would now have to face a new challenge from the steppes. The story of the Sassanian-Turkic rivalry is a reminder that the balance of power in Central Asia was always fragile, and that the threat from the nomadic frontier was a constant feature of the ancient world. The victory over the Hephthalites was a great achievement, but it was not a permanent solution. The struggle against the nomads would continue, and it would shape the destiny of Asia for centuries to come. The economic dimension of the Sassanian-Turkic rivalry was centered on the control of the silk trade. Silk, which was produced in China, was one of the most sought-after luxury goods in the ancient world. The trade in silk was incredibly lucrative, and the powers that controlled the trade routes grew rich on the profits. The Sassanian Empire, which was located between China and the Byzantine Empire, had traditionally been the middleman in the silk trade. The Persians would buy silk from Chinese and Central Asian merchants, and they would then sell it to the Byzantines at a huge markup. The Byzantines, who were the main consumers of silk in the West, resented the Persian monopoly, and they constantly sought to find alternative sources of silk. The rise of the Turkic Khaganate, which now controlled the land routes through Central Asia, created a new opportunity for the Byzantines. The Turks, who were eager to trade with the Byzantines, were willing to bypass the Persians and to sell their silk directly to Constantinople. This was a direct challenge to the Persian monopoly, and it was a challenge that the Sassanians could not ignore. The Sassanians tried to prevent the Turks from trading with the Byzantines, and they even sent ambassadors to Constantinople to complain about the Turkic overtures. But the Byzantines, who were eager to break the Persian monopoly, welcomed the Turks. The rivalry over the silk trade was a major factor in the growing tension between the Sassanians and the Turks. The two powers were competing for control of the most valuable trade route in the world, and this competition was a source of constant friction. The story of the Sassanian-Turkic rivalry over the silk trade is a story of economic competition, of diplomatic intrigue, and of the struggle for control of the global economy of the ancient world. The silk trade was a major force in the politics of the ancient world, and it played a crucial role in the relationship between the Sassanian Empire and its nomadic neighbors. The control of the silk trade was a prize worth fighting for, and the struggle for this prize was a major factor in the history of the region. The story of the silk trade is a reminder that economic interests are often at the heart of international relations, and that the desire for wealth and power is a constant feature of human history. The diplomatic maneuvering between the Sassanians and the Turks was as complex and intense as their military rivalry. Both powers used diplomacy as a weapon, seeking to outmaneuver the other and to secure their own interests. The Sassanians, who had a long tradition of diplomacy, were skilled in the art of negotiation. They used their wealth and their prestige to influence the various peoples and states of Central Asia. They formed alliances, offered subsidies, and played one group against another. The Turks, who were new to the world of international diplomacy, were less sophisticated, but they were quick learners. They used their military power to intimidate their neighbors, and they were not afraid to use force to achieve their goals. The diplomatic struggle between the two powers was a constant feature of the 6th and 7th centuries. The Sassanians and the Turks competed for the allegiance of the smaller states of Central Asia, such as the Sogdians and the Bactrians. They also competed for the favor of the Chinese, who were a major power in the region. The Chinese, who had their own interests in Central Asia, played the two powers against each other, skillfully maintaining the balance of power. The diplomatic maneuvering between the Sassanians and the Turks was a complex and fascinating game, a game that was played out over decades and that had far-reaching consequences. The fate of the smaller states of Central Asia often hung in the balance, as they were forced to choose sides in the great power rivalry. The story of the Sassanian-Turkic diplomatic rivalry is a reminder that diplomacy is not just about negotiation and compromise. It is also about power, intimidation, and the pursuit of national interest. The diplomatic history of the ancient world is a rich and complex subject, and the rivalry between the Sassanians and the Turks is one of its most important chapters. The diplomats of the ancient world, who operated in a world of shifting alliances and constant danger, were as skilled and as ruthless as any of their modern counterparts. The struggle for dominance in Central Asia was a struggle that was fought not just on the battlefield, but also in the courts and the council chambers of the great powers. The story of this diplomatic struggle is an essential part of the story of the Hephthalite Wars and their aftermath. The military confrontation between the Sassanians and the Turks, which eventually broke out despite the diplomatic efforts, was a major conflict that tested the strength of both empires. The first major war between the two powers occurred in the late 6th century, during the reign of the Sassanian king Hormizd IV, who ruled from 579 to 590 AD. The Turks, who had been expanding their territory, invaded the Sassanian Empire from the east. The Sassanian armies, which had been trained and reformed by Khosrow I, were able to repel the invasion and to inflict a heavy defeat on the Turks. The war between the Sassanians and the Turks was not a decisive conflict. It was a long and drawn-out struggle, with victories and defeats on both sides. The two powers fought a series of wars over the following decades, each seeking to gain the upper hand. The wars were fought primarily on the eastern frontier, in the region of Khorasan and Transoxiana. The Sassanians, who had the advantage of a strong defensive position, were generally able to hold their own against the Turkic attacks. But the constant warfare was a drain on the resources of both empires, and it weakened them in the face of other threats. The Sassanian-Turkic wars were a major factor in the decline of both powers. The Sassanians, who were also fighting against the Byzantines in the west, were stretched thin. The Turks, who were also fighting against the Chinese in the east, were similarly overextended. The constant warfare exhausted the resources of both empires and made them vulnerable to internal revolts and external invasions. The story of the Sassanian-Turkic wars is a story of mutual exhaustion, of two great powers that were locked in a struggle that neither could win. The wars were a tragedy for both sides, and they contributed to the eventual decline of both the Sassanian and the Turkic empires. The struggle for dominance in Central Asia, which had begun with the destruction of the Hephthalites, had ended in a stalemate that had cost both sides dearly. The legacy of the Sassanian-Turkic wars was a weakened and divided Central Asia, a region that would be vulnerable to the next wave of invaders, the Arabs, who would emerge from the south in the 7th century. The fall of the Sassanian Empire to the Arab conquest in the 7th century was a world historical event, and it was an event that was directly connected to the long history of warfare on the eastern frontier. The Sassanian Empire, which had been weakened by centuries of war against the Byzantines and the Turks, was unable to withstand the onslaught of the Arab armies. The Arab conquest of Persia, which took place between 633 and 651 AD, was swift and decisive. The Sassanian armies, which had been worn down by decades of conflict, were no match for the inspired and disciplined forces of the new Islamic State. The last Sassanian king, Yazdijir III, was defeated and killed, and the empire was incorporated into the expanding Islamic Caliphate. The fall of the Sassanian Empire was a catastrophe for the Persian people, and it marked the end of an era. The ancient civilization of Persia, which had been one of the great powers of the world for centuries, was now under the rule of a new, foreign empire. The Arab conquest of Persia was a direct result of the weakness that had been caused by the long wars on the eastern frontier. The Hephthalite Wars, which had taken place 2 centuries earlier, had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the destruction of the Sassanian Empire. The wars had weakened the empire, both militarily and economically, and they had created a legacy of instability and conflict that would plague the Sassanian state for the rest of its existence. The fall of the Sassanian Empire was a tragedy, but it was also a transformation. The Persian culture and civilization, which had been so powerful, was not extinguished. It was absorbed into the new Islamic civilization, and it would continue to influence the world for centuries to come. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is an essential part of the story of the fall of the Sassanian Empire. The wars were a turning point in the history of Persia, a moment when the empire began its long and slow decline towards its eventual destruction. The terror from the east, which had struck such fear into the hearts of the Persians, had ultimately contributed to the fall of the mightiest empire of the ancient world. The legacy of the Hephthalite Wars is a complex and multifaceted one. For the Sassanian Empire, the wars were a catastrophe, a period of military defeat, political humiliation, and economic decline. But the wars were also a catalyst for change, forcing the Persians to reform their state and their army, and ultimately leading to the Golden Age of Khosrow I. For India, the Hunna invasions were a major factor in the decline of the Gupta Empire, but they also contributed to the cultural and political transformation of the subcontinent. For Central Asia, the rise and fall of the Hephthalite Empire was a major event, which reshaped the political map of the region and paved the way for the rise of the Turkic Khaganate. The Hephthalite Wars were a turning point in the history of Asia, a moment when the balance of power shifted and a new era began. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder of the constant interplay between the settled world and the nomadic frontier, and of the profound impact that the peoples of the steppes have had on the course of history. The Hephthalites, who were once the terror of the East, have left a lasting legacy, a legacy that is still being studied and debated by historians. The story of their wars against the Persian Empire is one of the most dramatic and important chapters in the history of the ancient world, and it is a story that deserves to be remembered. The White Huns, who emerged from the vastness of the steppes to challenge the greatest empires of their age, may have ultimately been defeated, but they left their mark on the world, a mark that can still be seen in the political, cultural, and demographic landscape of Asia today. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a story of hubris and catastrophe, of reform and recovery, and of the enduring struggle between civilization and the forces of the wild. It is a story that has much to teach us about the nature of power, the resilience of the human spirit, and the complex and often tragic course of human history. The history of the Sassanian Empire's eastern frontier is a recurring cycle of conflict, adaptation, and temporary resolution. The empire, which was based in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau, was perpetually drawn into the affairs of Central Asia, a region of vast steppes, rugged mountains, and nomadic peoples. The eastern frontier was not a fixed border. It was a fluid zone of interaction, where the influence of the Persian state waxed and waned depending on the strength of the central government and the pressure from the steppes. The Sassanian kings, who were constantly preoccupied with the threat from the Roman Empire in the west, often neglected the eastern frontier, leaving it vulnerable to attack. But the east was just as important as the west, and the kings who ignored this fact often paid a heavy price. The Hephthalite Wars were the most dramatic example of this recurring cycle. The Sassanian kings, who had been focused on the west, were caught off guard by the rise of the Hephthalites. The result was a series of disastrous defeats, which brought the empire to the brink of collapse. The recovery, under Kavad I and Khosrow I, was a long and painful process, and it required a fundamental rethinking of the empire's strategic priorities. The Sassanian kings learned that the eastern frontier could not be ignored, and that the threat from the steppes was just as serious as the threat from the west. The lesson was learned at a great cost, and it was a lesson that would be passed down to the successors of the Sassanians, the Arab caliphs, who would also struggle to control the volatile eastern frontier. The history of the eastern frontier of the Sassanian Empire is a history of constant struggle, a struggle that was as much about culture and economics as it was about military power. It is a story that reveals the fundamental challenges of empire building in a region that was always on the edge of chaos. The eastern frontier was a crucible, a place where the Persian state was tested and tempered, and where its ultimate fate was often decided. The Hephthalite Wars were the ultimate test, and the Sassanian Empire, despite its near collapse, ultimately passed, emerging stronger and more resilient than before. But the victory was temporary, and the cycle of conflict would continue, ultimately leading to the fall of the empire to the Arab invaders. The story of the eastern frontier is a central chapter in the history of the Sassanian Empire, and it is a chapter that is essential to understanding the rise and fall of this great civilization. The logistical challenges of campaigning in Central Asia were enormous, and they played a major role in the outcome of the Hephthalite Wars. The armies of the ancient world were dependent on supplies of food, water, and fodder for their horses. The further they advanced into enemy territory, the more difficult it became to maintain these supplies. The arid and semi-arid landscapes of Central Asia were particularly challenging. Water sources were scarce and often far apart, and the heat of the summer could be brutal. The Sassanian army, which was composed of heavy cavalry and infantry, required vast amounts of supplies. The cataphracts, with their heavy armor and their large horses, were particularly demanding. The logistical challenges of campaigning in Central Asia meant that the Sassanian armies were often forced to operate at the limits of their endurance. They were vulnerable to attacks on their supply lines, and they could be defeated simply by being cut off from their sources of water and food. The Hephthalites, who were masters of the terrain, exploited these vulnerabilities with great skill. They would lead the Persian armies into the desert, deny them access to water, and then attack them when they were weakened and demoralized. The disaster of 484, which we have already described, was a perfect example of this strategy. The Persian army, lured into a trap, was cut off from water and then annihilated. The logistical challenges of campaigning in Central Asia were a major factor in the Hephthalite victories. The Persians, who were accustomed to fighting in the more fertile and well-watered lands of Mesopotamia and the Levant, were ill-prepared for the harsh conditions of the steppe. The Hephthalites, who were born and raised in this environment, were perfectly adapted to it. The logistical mismatch between the two armies was a key factor in the outcome of the war. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a reminder that military success is not just about bravery and tactics. It is also about logistics, about the ability to keep an army supplied and fighting fit in the most challenging of conditions. The Sassanians, for all their military prowess, were ultimately defeated by the harsh realities of the Central Asian environment, and by an enemy who knew how to use that environment to his advantage. The lessons of the Hephthalite Wars were not lost on the later Sassanian kings, who paid much more attention to the logistical challenges of campaigning on the eastern frontier. The Great Wall of Gorgan, which was built by Khosrow I, was a response to these challenges, a way of protecting the settled lands of Khorasan from the raids of the steppe nomads. The history of the eastern frontier is a history of adaptation, of the slow and painful process of learning to cope with the unique challenges of a harsh and unforgiving environment. The cultural exchange between the Sassanian Empire and the Hephthalites was not limited to the realm of warfare. The two peoples also interacted in the realms of trade, art, and religion. The Hephthalites, who controlled the trade routes of the Silk Road, were in constant contact with the Persians, and this contact led to the exchange of goods and ideas. The Hephthalites adopted many elements of Persian culture, including the use of the Persian language and the adoption of Zoroastrian religious practices. The Hephthalite coins, which were minted in imitation of Sassanian models, are a testament to this cultural exchange. The coins often depict the Hephthalite kings in the style of the Sassanian Shahs, with the same crowns and the same royal symbols. The Hephthalites also adopted the Sassanian administrative system, and they used Persian officials to help them govern their empire. The cultural exchange was not one way. The Sassanians also adopted some Hephthalite customs, particularly in the realm of military technology. The Hephthalites were renowned for their skill in mounted archery, and the Sassanians may have learned some of their techniques from them. The cultural exchange between the two peoples was a complex and ongoing process, and it is a reminder that even in times of war, cultures can interact and influence one another. The Hephthalites, who are often portrayed as destructive barbarians, were also active participants in the cultural life of the region. They were patrons of art and architecture, and they contributed to the development of the unique cultural synthesis that characterized Central Asia in the 5th and 6th centuries. The story of the cultural exchange between the Sassanians and the Hephthalites is a story of mutual influence, a story that challenges the simple narrative of barbarian invasion and civilized resistance. The relationship between the two peoples was complex and multifaceted, and it was a relationship that was defined as much by cooperation and exchange as it was by conflict. The cultural legacy of the Hephthalites can still be seen in the art and architecture of Central Asia, and it is a legacy that is an important part of the history of the region. The Hephthalite period was a time of great creativity and cultural synthesis, and it was a time that laid the foundation for the later cultural achievements of the Islamic world. The numismatic evidence, the study of coins, is one of the most important sources for the history of the Hephthalites. The Hephthalites, like the Sassanians, minted their own coins, and these coins provide valuable information about their history, their culture, and their economy. The earliest Hephthalite coins were imitations of Sassanian drams, bearing the image of the Sassanian king. Later, the Hephthalites began to mint their own distinctive coins, bearing the images of their own kings. These coins are often inscribed with the names and titles of the Hephthalite rulers, and they provide a chronological framework for the history of the Hephthalite Empire. The coins also provide information about the Hephthalite economy. The fact that they minted coins at all is a sign of their economic sophistication. The coins were used in trade, and they circulated widely throughout Central Asia and beyond. The Hephthalite coins are also a testament to their cultural connections. The coins often bear symbols and inscriptions that are drawn from Persian, Indian, and even Greek traditions. They are a visual record of the cultural synthesis that characterized the Hephthalite Empire. The study of Hephthalite coins is a specialized field, and it has yielded important insights into the history of this mysterious people. The coins have helped scholars to identify the Hephthalite kings, to establish the chronology of their reigns, and to trace the extent of their empire. The numismatic evidence is a reminder that the Hephthalites were not a primitive people. They were a sophisticated and organized society, with their own currency and their own economic system. The coins are a tangible link to the past, a way of connecting with the people who minted and used them so many centuries ago. The study of Hephthalite coins is an ongoing process, and new discoveries are constantly being made. The coins are a treasure trove of information, and they continue to shed new light on the history of the Hephthalite Empire. The numismatic evidence is a crucial source for the history of the Hephthalites, and it is a source that is often overlooked in popular accounts. The coins tell a story of a powerful and sophisticated empire, an empire that was a major player in the politics and economics of the ancient world. The story of the Hephthalites, as revealed by their coins, is a story that deserves to be better known. The archaeological evidence for the Hephthalites is also important, though it is often more difficult to interpret. The Hephthalites, who were a nomadic people, did not leave behind the same kind of monumental architecture as the settled empires. Their settlements were often temporary, and their buildings were made of perishable materials. However, archaeologists have been able to identify a number of sites that are associated with the Hephthalites, particularly in the region of Bactria and Sogdiana. These sites have yielded a wealth of artifacts, including pottery, metalwork, and weapons. The artifacts provide valuable information about the material culture of the Hephthalites, their way of life, and their artistic traditions. The most distinctive of the Hephthalite artifacts are the coins, which we have already discussed, and the pottery, which is often decorated with distinctive designs. The Hephthalite pottery is often handmade, and it is characterized by its simple shapes and its coarse fabric. The metalwork of the Hephthalites is also distinctive, and it includes weapons, tools, and ornaments. The weapons, such as swords, daggers, and arrowheads, are evidence of the Hephthalites' martial culture. The ornaments, such as belt buckles and brooches, are evidence of their love of personal adornment. The archaeological evidence for the Hephthalites is not as rich as the evidence for the Sassanians or the Romans, but it is still significant. It helps to fill in the gaps in the written record and to provide a more complete picture of this enigmatic people. The archaeological work in Central Asia is ongoing, and new discoveries are constantly being made. The future of Hephthalite studies is bright, and the archaeological evidence is likely to play an increasingly important role in our understanding of this fascinating people. The story of the Hephthalites is a story that is still being uncovered, and the archaeological evidence is a crucial part of this process of discovery. The Hephthalites, who were once lost to history, are now being rediscovered, thanks to the work of archaeologists and historians. The archaeological and numismatic evidence is a reminder that history is not just about written records. It is also about the physical remains of the past, the artifacts, and the monuments that the people of the past left behind. The study of these remains is essential to understanding the full story of the human past, and it is a study that is constantly evolving. The legacy of the Hephthalites in the modern world is a subtle but significant one. The peoples of Central Asia, particularly those in Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, are the descendants of the many different groups who have inhabited the region over the centuries, including the Hephthalites. The genetic heritage of the Hephthalites is likely still present in the populations of these countries, though it is difficult to isolate. The cultural legacy of the Hephthalites is also present in the traditions, the customs, and the languages of the region. The names of places and peoples in Central Asia often have their roots in the Hephthalite period. The city of Balkh, which was one of the centers of the Hephthalite Empire, is still a major city in northern Afghanistan. The legacy of the Hephthalites is also present in the wider world. The games of chess and backgammon, which were popularized in the Sassanian court, may have been influenced by the Hephthalites. The Hephthalites, who were in contact with both Persia and India, may have played a role in the transmission of these games. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that the past is not a foreign country, it is a part of our present. The peoples and the cultures of the ancient world are the ancestors of the peoples and the cultures of today. The history of the Hephthalites is not just a story of the past. It is a story that is relevant to the present, a story that can help us to understand the complex and often troubled history of Central Asia. The region, which has been a crossroads of civilizations for millennia, is still a place of conflict and instability. The struggle for control of Central Asia, which was a major theme of the ancient world, continues to this day. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that the forces that shape the region are deep-rooted and complex, and that the challenges of the present are often rooted in the past. The legacy of the Hephthalites is a part of this story, and it is a legacy that we should all strive to understand. The White Huns, who once terrorized the great empires of the ancient world, are now a part of history, but their story is a reminder of the constant struggle for power and survival that has shaped the destiny of humanity. The death of Peroz I in 484 AD is one of the most dramatic and poignant moments in the history of the Sassanian Empire. The king, who had set out with such confidence and such a vast army, ended his life in a hidden ditch on a desolate plain, surrounded by the bodies of his slain soldiers. The image of the proud king, humbled and destroyed by his nomadic enemies, is a powerful symbol of the fragility of power and the dangers of imperial overreach. The death of Peroz was not just a personal tragedy, it was a national catastrophe. The king was the embodiment of the state, and his death left the empire leaderless and vulnerable. The news of the disaster sent shockwaves through the empire, and it emboldened the enemies of the Sassanians on all fronts. The death of Peroz was a turning point in the history of the Sassanian Empire, a moment when the old certainties were shattered and a new era of uncertainty began. The story of Peroz's death is a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of pride and the consequences of underestimating an enemy. The king, who had refused to accept the reality of his previous defeats, had led his army to its doom. The death of Peroz was a tragedy that could have been avoided, and it is a tragedy that has been remembered for over 1500 years. The memory of Peroz, the king who was killed by the White Huns, was preserved in the Persian historical tradition, and it was used as a warning to future kings. The story of Peroz is a reminder that the greatest leaders are not always the most successful, and that the most powerful empires are not always the most resilient. The death of Peroz was a lesson in humility, a lesson that the Persian Empire would learn at a terrible cost. The king who had claimed to be the king of kings, the ruler of the world, had died in a ditch, a victim of his own ambition and his own folly. The death of Peroz I is one of the great tragedies of ancient history, and it is a tragedy that continues to resonate to this day. The impact of the disaster of 484 on the morale of the Sassanian Empire was devastating. The empire, which had been built on a foundation of military success and divine favor, was suddenly confronted with the reality of its own vulnerability. The belief in the invincibility of the Persian army, which had been a central pillar of the Sassanian state, was shattered. The death of the king, who was seen as the representative of the gods on earth, was a profound religious and psychological shock. The people of the empire, who had been accustomed to victory and prosperity, were now faced with defeat, humiliation, and economic hardship. The morale of the army, which had been the backbone of the empire, was broken. The soldiers, who had witnessed the destruction of their comrades and the death of their king, were demoralized and unwilling to fight. The result was a period of military weakness, during which the empire was vulnerable to attacks from all sides. The Hephthalites, who were quick to exploit the situation, invaded and plundered the eastern provinces. The Byzantines, who were always watching for an opportunity, began to press on the western frontier. The internal stability of the empire was also threatened. The death of Peroz had left a power vacuum, and the empire was thrown into a civil war as various factions vied for control of the throne. The period following the disaster of 484 was one of the darkest in the history of the Sassanian Empire. The state, which had been a beacon of stability and prosperity, was now a shadow of its former self, struggling to survive in a world that had become much more dangerous and uncertain. The morale of the empire was at an all-time low, and it would take decades of strong leadership and wise policies to restore the confidence of the people and the strength of the state. The story of the aftermath of 484 is a story of crisis and recovery, a story of how a great empire was able to pull itself back from the brink of collapse. It is a story that is as inspiring as it is tragic, and it is a story that is essential to understanding the history of the Sassanian Empire. The reforms of Kavad I and Khosrow I were not just a response to the immediate crisis. They were a fundamental transformation of the Sassanian state. The old system, which was based on the power of the great noble families and the Zoroastrian clergy, was replaced by a new system, based on the power of the central government. The kings, who had once been first among equals, became true autocrats, with absolute power over the lives of their subjects. The reforms touched every aspect of the state, from the tax system to the military to the administration. The tax reform, which was the most important of the reforms, created a more efficient and equitable system of taxation. The old system, which was based on a chaotic and unfair system of land grants and tax exemptions, was replaced by a new system, based on a comprehensive survey of the land and a fixed rate of taxation. This reform provided the government with a reliable source of revenue, and it reduced the power of the nobles, who had been the main beneficiaries of the old system. The military reform, which was also crucial, created a new standing army, paid directly by the crown. This army was more loyal and more effective than the old feudal levies, and it was capable of defending the empire against its enemies. The administrative reform, which was the third major reform, created a more centralized and bureaucratic administration. This reform strengthened the power of the monarchy and reduced the power of the provincial governors. The reforms of Kavad and Khosrow transformed the Sassanian Empire into a more centralized, more efficient, and more powerful state. The reforms were a success, and they laid the foundation for the golden age of the Sassanian Empire. The state that had been humbled by the Hephthalites was now stronger than ever, and it was ready to face the challenges of the future. The story of the Sassanian reforms is a story of institutional innovation, of political will, and of the capacity of a determined ruler to transform his state. The reforms were not just a response to the Hephthalite threat, they were a proactive attempt to create a better and more just society, and they were a major factor in the success of the Sassanian Empire in the decades that followed. The reforms of Kavad and Khosrow are a model for reform movements throughout history, and they are a testament to the power of good government to transform a society. The Great Wall of Gorgan, which was built during the reign of Khosrow I, is one of the most impressive engineering feats of the ancient world. The wall, which is also known as the Red Snake or the Great Wall of Gorgan, stretches for over 190 kilometers, about 120 miles, from the Caspian Sea to the mountains of northeastern Iran. It was built to defend the fertile lands of Khorasan from the raids of the steppe nomads. The wall is not a single structure, it is a complex system of fortifications, including a massive brick wall, a deep ditch, and a series of forts and watchtowers. The construction of the wall was a massive undertaking, requiring the labor of thousands of workers and the resources of the entire empire. The wall is a testament to the engineering skills of the Sassanians, and to their determination to defend their eastern frontier. The wall was a response to the lessons learned in the Hephthalite Wars. The Sassanians had learned that the open steppe was a hostile environment, and that the best way to defend the settled lands was to build a physical barrier that would slow down the nomadic raids. The wall was not a perfect defense, but it was a significant deterrent, and it helped to stabilize the eastern frontier for decades. The Great Wall of Gorgan is a reminder of the constant threat posed by the steppe nomads, and of the efforts that the settled empires made to defend themselves. The wall is also a reminder of the scale and the sophistication of the Sassanian state, which was capable of undertaking such a massive engineering project. The Great Wall of Gorgan is a symbol of the Sassanian Empire, a symbol of its power, its wealth, and its determination to defend its civilization. The wall is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it is a major tourist attraction. It is a reminder of the ancient history of Iran, and it is a testament to the enduring legacy of the Sassanian Empire. The Great Wall of Gorgan is one of the most important archaeological sites in Iran, and it is a site that deserves to be better known. The story of the wall is a story of defense, of engineering, and of the constant struggle between the settled world and the nomadic frontier. It is a story that is as relevant today as it was 1500 years ago. The alliance between the Sassanians and the Turks, which destroyed the Hephthalite Empire, was a masterpiece of realpolitik. It was a pragmatic and effective strategy, and it was a strategy that would have far-reaching consequences. The alliance was not based on any shared values or any genuine friendship. It was based on a shared enemy and a shared desire for territorial expansion. The Sassanians wanted to eliminate the Hephthalite threat and to secure their eastern frontier. The Turks wanted to expand their territory and to control the trade routes of the Silk Road. The two powers, who had nothing else in common, were united by their hatred of the Hephthalites. The alliance was a classic example of the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It was a principle that was well understood by the rulers of the ancient world, and it was a principle that was applied with great skill by Khosrow I. The alliance with the Turks was a bold and risky move. The Turks were an unknown quantity, and there was no guarantee that they would be reliable allies. But Khosrow was willing to take the risk, and the risk paid off. The alliance was a success, and it led to the destruction of the Hephthalite Empire. The success of the alliance was a major factor in the recovery of the Sassanian Empire. The destruction of the Hephthalites removed a major threat to the eastern frontier, and it allowed the Sassanians to focus their attention on the west. The alliance with the Turks was a turning point in the history of the Sassanian Empire, and it was a turning point in the history of Central Asia. The destruction of the Hephthalites created a new balance of power, and it paved the way for the rise of the Turkic Khaganate. The alliance between the Sassanians and the Turks was a short-lived one, but it had a lasting impact on the region. The story of the alliance is a reminder that in the world of international politics, there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. There are only permanent interests. The rulers of the ancient world understood this principle well, and they used it to their advantage. The alliance between the Sassanians and the Turks is a perfect example of the application of this principle, and it is a lesson that is still relevant in the world today. The destruction of the Hephthalite Empire was a major event in world history, but it was not the end of the story. The Hephthalites, as we have seen, were not completely annihilated. Many of them were absorbed into the Turkic Khaganate, while others remained in their ancestral lands. The Hephthalite principalities in India continued to exist for a time, and they played a role in the subsequent history of the subcontinent. The legacy of the Hephthalites lived on in the cultures and the peoples of Central Asia and India. The destruction of the Hephthalite Empire also had unintended consequences. The rise of the Turkic Khaganate, which was a direct result of the destruction of the Hephthalites, created a new and even more powerful threat to the Sassanian Empire. The Turks, who were a nomadic people like the Hephthalites, were just as ambitious and just as aggressive. They began to expand their territory, and they soon came into conflict with the Sassanians. The alliance that had destroyed the Hephthalites quickly turned into a rivalry. The Sassanians, who had hoped to secure their eastern frontier, now found themselves facing a new and potentially more dangerous enemy. The story of the destruction of the Hephthalite Empire is a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of power politics. The victory over the Hephthalites was a great achievement, but it was a victory that created new problems. The cycle of nomadic invasion and imperial response continued, and the Sassanian Empire would eventually be overwhelmed by the next wave of invaders, the Arabs. The destruction of the Hephthalite Empire was a turning point in the history of Asia, but it was not the end of the struggle between the settled world and the nomadic frontier. The struggle would continue for centuries, and it would shape the destiny of the region. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that history is not a linear progression towards progress. It is a cycle of rise and fall, of conflict and resolution, of destruction and creation. The Hephthalites rose to power, dominated a vast territory, and then were destroyed by a coalition of their enemies. Their story is a microcosm of the history of Central Asia, a region that has always been a place of constant change and upheaval. The legacy of the Hephthalites is a complex one, but it is a legacy that is an important part of the history of Asia, and it is a legacy that deserves to be remembered. The story of the Hephthalites is a powerful reminder of the impact that nomadic peoples have had on the course of history. For centuries, the settled civilizations of the ancient world viewed the nomads of the steppes as savages and barbarians, people who were outside the bounds of civilization. But the nomads were not simply destructive forces. They were also agents of change, who played a crucial role in the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between the East and the West. The nomads were the masters of the Silk Road, the great trade route that connected China to the Mediterranean. They were the ones who transported the silk, the spices, and the other luxury goods that fueled the economies of the ancient world. The nomads were also the conduits for the spread of religions, such as Buddhism and Islam, and for the transmission of scientific and technological knowledge. The nomads were not just raiders and conquerors. They were also merchants, missionaries, and cultural brokers. The Hephthalites were a perfect example of this dual role. They were fierce warriors, who terrorized the great empires of their time. But they were also skilled traders, who controlled the flow of goods across Central Asia. The Hephthalite period was a time of intense cultural exchange, a time when the traditions of Persia, India, and China came into contact and blended together. The legacy of the Hephthalites is not just a legacy of war and destruction, it is also a legacy of cultural exchange and synthesis. The nomads of the steppes have often been marginalized in the historical record, dismissed as mere barbarians. But the story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that the nomads were an essential part of the ancient world, and that their contribution to the history of civilization has been immense. The history of the ancient world cannot be understood without understanding the nomads, and the story of the Hephthalites is a crucial chapter in that history. The terror from the east, which the settled empires so feared, was also a source of innovation and change, a force that helped to shape the world in which we live today. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as the enemies of civilization, are now recognized as one of the many peoples who have contributed to the rich tapestry of human history. The military tactics of the Hephthalites were not unique. They were the product of centuries of development by the nomadic peoples of the steppes. The Hephthalites built upon the traditions of their predecessors, such as the Xiongnu and the Scythians, and they refined these traditions to a high degree of perfection. The core of the Hephthalite military system was the mounted archer. The Hephthalite warrior was trained from childhood to ride and to shoot. He could fire his bow with deadly accuracy while riding at a full gallop, and he could reload quickly and efficiently. The Hephthalite cavalry was highly mobile, capable of covering vast distances quickly and of striking without warning. The Hephthalites were also skilled in the use of other weapons, including the sword, the lance, and the lasso. The Hephthalite army was organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, a system that was common among the nomadic peoples. This organization allowed for a high degree of command and control, and it made the Hephthalite army a disciplined and effective fighting force. The Hephthalites were also skilled in the use of psychological warfare. They would often mutilate their enemies, displaying their severed heads on poles, in order to intimidate their opponents. Their reputation for cruelty was a weapon in itself, and it often caused their enemies to flee in terror. The military tactics of the Hephthalites were a major factor in their success. They were able to defeat the armies of the great empires, not because they were more numerous or better equipped, but because they were more mobile, more disciplined, and more ruthless. The Hephthalite military system was a product of the steppe environment, and it was a system that was perfectly adapted to the conditions of warfare in Central Asia. The story of the Hephthalite military is a story of adaptation, of the evolution of a way of war that was ideally suited to the challenges of the steppe. The Hephthalites, who were the masters of this way of war, were able to carve out a vast empire and to challenge the greatest powers of their time. The legacy of the Hephthalite military can still be seen in the military traditions of the peoples of Central Asia, and it is a legacy that is an important part of the history of warfare. The political organization of the Hephthalite Empire is not well understood, due to the lack of written sources from the Hephthalites themselves. However, it is clear that the Hephthalites had a complex political system, with a king at its head and a hierarchy of nobles and chieftains. The Hephthalite king, who bore the title of Hephthalite, or King of the Hephthalites, was the supreme ruler, and his authority was absolute. He was the commander-in-chief of the army, the chief judge, and the head of the state religion. The king was surrounded by a court of nobles and officials, who helped him to govern the realm. The nobles, who were the heads of the various clans and tribes that made up the Hephthalite confederation, held significant power, and they could sometimes challenge the authority of the king. The Hephthalite Empire was not a centralized state like the Sassanian Empire. It was a confederation, a loose union of tribes and clans that were held together by the personality of the king and by the shared interest in plunder and tribute. The empire was divided into provinces, each of which was governed by a member of the royal family or by a trusted noble. The provinces were largely autonomous, and they were expected to provide troops and tribute to the king when required. The Hephthalite political system was flexible and adaptable, and it was well suited to the conditions of the steppe. It allowed the Hephthalites to govern a vast territory with a minimum of bureaucracy, and it allowed them to respond quickly to threats and opportunities. The political organization of the Hephthalite Empire was a key factor in its success. It was a system that was based on loyalty and personal relationships, rather than on impersonal institutions. It was a system that was perfectly adapted to the needs of a nomadic empire, and it was a system that would be emulated by later nomadic empires, such as the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan. The story of the Hephthalite political system is a story of adaptation, of the evolution of a system of government that was ideally suited to the challenges of ruling a vast and diverse empire on the steppes of Central Asia. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as mere barbarians, were in fact skilled politicians, capable of building and maintaining a complex political system. The economy of the Hephthalite Empire was based on a combination of pastoralism, agriculture, and trade. The Hephthalites, who were originally a nomadic people, continued to practice pastoralism, raising horses, sheep, and cattle on the steppes. The horses were particularly important, as they were the foundation of the Hephthalite military power. The Hephthalites also engaged in agriculture, particularly in the fertile valleys of Bactria and Sogdiana, where they grew wheat, barley, and other crops. The agricultural surplus provided the Hephthalites with the food they needed to support their growing population and their large army. The most important source of Hephthalite wealth, however, was trade. The Hephthalites controlled the trade routes of the Silk Road, and they taxed the caravans that passed through their territory. The Silk Road was the great artery of commerce that connected China to the Mediterranean, and the Hephthalites were the toll-keepers of this vital route. The trade brought them immense wealth, in the form of gold, silver, silk, and other luxury goods. The Hephthalites also extracted tribute from the neighboring empires, including the Sassanians and the Guptas. The tribute payments were a major source of revenue, and they were a symbol of the Hephthalites' dominance. The economy of the Hephthalite Empire was a sophisticated and diversified one, and it was a major factor in the empire's success. The Hephthalites were not just raiders, they were also merchants, farmers, and administrators. They built a complex economy that was capable of supporting a large and powerful state. The story of the Hephthalite economy is a story of adaptation, of the evolution of an economy that was ideally suited to the conditions of Central Asia. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as mere parasites, were in fact skilled economic managers, capable of building and maintaining a prosperous empire. The economic legacy of the Hephthalites can still be seen in the trade routes and the commercial networks of Central Asia, and it is a legacy that is an important part of the history of the region. The religious beliefs of the Hephthalites are not well understood, due to the lack of written sources. It is likely that they practiced a form of shamanism, which was common among the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. Shamanism is a belief system that is based on the idea that the world is inhabited by spirits, both good and evil, and that these spirits can be influenced by shamans, who are religious specialists with the power to communicate with the spirit world. The Hephthalites probably also practiced ancestor worship, and they may have worshipped the sky god, Tengri, who was a common deity among the nomadic peoples. The Hephthalites were exposed to other religions, including Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Manichaeism, and it is likely that some of them converted to these faiths. The Hephthalite coins, which sometimes bear religious symbols, provide some clues about their religious beliefs. The coins often depict the Hephthalite kings with a solar halo, which may indicate a belief in the divine nature of kingship. The Hephthalites were generally tolerant of other religions, and they allowed their subjects to practice their own faiths. This tolerance was a pragmatic policy, designed to maintain stability in a diverse empire. The religious policies of the Hephthalites were in contrast to those of some of their predecessors, such as the Sassanians, who had a state religion and who sometimes persecuted religious minorities. The Hephthalites, who were a minority in their own empire, understood the importance of religious tolerance. The story of the Hephthalite religion is a story of diversity and tolerance, of a people who were open to new ideas and who were willing to coexist with people of different faiths. The religious legacy of the Hephthalites is not as well known as their military legacy, but it is an important part of their story. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as fanatical barbarians, were in fact pragmatic and tolerant rulers, who understood the importance of religious freedom in a diverse and complex empire. The Hephthalite Empire, at its height, was one of the largest and most powerful states in the world. It stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Indus River, and from the Aral Sea to the Hindu Kush. It controlled the vital trade routes of the Silk Road, and it extracted tribute from the great empires of Persia and India. The Hephthalite Empire was a major center of political, economic, and cultural activity. Its capital, which was probably located in the region of Balkh or Samarkand, was a cosmopolitan city, home to people of many different ethnicities and religions. The Hephthalite Empire was not a monolithic entity. It was a diverse and complex confederation, held together by the power of the king and by the shared interests of its constituent peoples. The empire was a testament to the ability of the nomadic peoples to build and maintain large and sophisticated states. The Hephthalite Empire was not as long-lived as some of the great empires of the ancient world, but it was no less significant. Its rise and fall were major events in the history of Asia, and its legacy is still felt today. The Hephthalite Empire was a bridge between the worlds of the steppe and the zone, a place where different cultures came into contact and blended together. It was a crucible of cultural exchange, a place where the traditions of Persia, India, and China were fused into new and unique forms. The Hephthalite Empire, which was once dismissed as a mere barbarian kingdom, is now recognized as a major player in the history of the ancient world. Its story is a reminder that the nomadic peoples of the steppes were not just destroyers of civilization. They were also builders, creators, and agents of change. The Hephthalite Empire, which was the terror of the East, was also a center of culture and commerce, and its legacy is an important part of the story of Asia. The relationship between the Sassanian Empire and the Roman Empire, and later the Byzantine Empire, was a central axis of ancient world politics. The two empires, which were the superpowers of their age, were locked in a perpetual struggle for dominance. Their rivalry, which lasted for centuries, was fought on the battlefields of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and Anatolia. The Sassanian and Roman empires were not always at war. There were periods of peace and even cooperation. But the underlying dynamic was one of competition and mistrust. The two empires saw each other as the main obstacle to their own ambitions, and they were constantly seeking to weaken and undermine each other. The Hephthalite Wars, which were fought on the distant eastern frontier, had a profound impact on the balance of power between the Sassanians and the Romans. The disasters suffered by the Sassanians at the hands of the Hephthalites weakened them and forced them to divert resources away from the Western Front. The Byzantines, who were the heirs of the Roman Empire, were quick to take advantage of the Sassanian weakness. They pressed their claims on the border, and they sometimes refused to pay the subsidies that the Sassanians had come to expect. The Hephthalite Wars, in this sense, were a major factor in the shifting balance of power between the two great empires of the ancient world. The Sassanian Empire, which had been a major threat to the Romans, was temporarily neutralized by the Hephthalites. This allowed the Byzantines to consolidate their position and to focus their attention on other threats. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is therefore not just a story of the eastern frontier. It is also a story about the geopolitics of the ancient world, about the complex interplay between the great powers of the age. The Hephthalites, who were a relatively minor power, were able to influence the course of history by exploiting the rivalries between the great empires. Their wars against the Sassanians had consequences that were felt far beyond the steppes of Central Asia, consequences that shaped the history of the Mediterranean world as well. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that the ancient world was an interconnected system, where events in one region could have profound effects on regions far away. The diplomatic relations between the Sassanian Empire and the Byzantine Empire were a complex web of treaties, alliances, and rivalries. The two empires, despite their mutual animosity, were often forced to cooperate, particularly when faced with common threats, such as the nomadic peoples of the steppes. The diplomatic correspondence between the two empires was often conducted in a language of mutual respect, even when the underlying relationship was hostile. The emperors of the two empires addressed each other as brother, and they exchanged gifts and letters. The diplomatic protocols were elaborate, and they were designed to maintain a facade of civility even in times of war. The two empires also engaged in a complex game of espionage and intrigue. They would send spies into each other's territory, and they would attempt to stir up internal dissent. They would also form alliances with the smaller states and peoples on the periphery of the two empires, using them as proxies in their struggle for dominance. The Hephthalites were one of the many third parties that were drawn into the great power rivalry between the Sassanians and the Byzantines. The Byzantines, who were eager to weaken the Sassanians, sometimes provided financial or diplomatic support to the Hephthalites. The Sassanians, for their part, sought to prevent the Byzantines from forming an alliance with their eastern enemies. The diplomatic relations between the Sassanians and the Byzantines were a constant feature of the ancient world, and they played a major role in the course of history. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is intertwined with the story of the Sassanian-Byzantine rivalry. The wars on the eastern frontier were fought in the shadow of the great power rivalry in the west, and they had a direct impact on the balance of power between the two empires. The diplomatic history of the ancient world is a rich and complex subject, and it is a subject that is essential to understanding the Hephthalite Wars and their aftermath. The Hephthalites, who were often dismissed as barbarians, were in fact skilled players in the game of international politics, and they were able to exploit the rivalries between the great powers to their own advantage. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that even the smallest and most marginalized peoples can have a significant impact on the course of history. The role of the Hephthalites in the transmission of knowledge and technology between the East and the West is often overlooked. The Hephthalites, who controlled the trade routes of the Silk Road, were in a unique position to facilitate the exchange of ideas and technologies. They were in contact with the civilizations of China, India, Persia, and the Byzantine Empire, and they acted as intermediaries between these different worlds. The Hephthalites were responsible for the transmission of a number of important technologies, including the stirrup, which was a crucial innovation in the history of warfare. The stirrup, which allowed a rider to maintain his balance while fighting on horseback, was a major factor in the development of heavy cavalry. The Hephthalites, who were master horsemen, may have been responsible for spreading the use of the stirrup to the west. The Hephthalites were also involved in the transmission of religious ideas. They were exposed to Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity, and they may have played a role in the spread of these religions along the Silk Road. The Hephthalite Empire was a melting pot of cultures, and it was a place where different ideas and traditions came into contact and blended together. The story of the Hephthalites is not just a story of war and conquest, it is also a story of cultural exchange and technological innovation. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as mere barbarians, were in fact important agents of cultural transmission. They helped to connect the different parts of the ancient world, and they played a role in the development of a shared Eurasian culture. The legacy of the Hephthalites in the realm of cultural and technological exchange is a lasting one, and it is a legacy that is often overlooked in the traditional narratives of history. The Hephthalites, who were once the terror of the East, were also the carriers of ideas and technologies, and their contribution to the history of civilization is immense. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that the exchange of knowledge and technology is a fundamental driver of human progress, and that the peoples who facilitate this exchange, even if they are often forgotten, play a crucial role in shaping the world. The influence of the Hephthalites on the art and architecture of Central Asia is a subject that is only beginning to be explored by scholars. The Hephthalites, who were a nomadic people, did not leave behind the same kind of monumental architecture as the settled empires. However, they did contribute to the development of a distinctive style of art and architecture that is evident in the archaeological record. The Hephthalite period was a time of great artistic creativity, a time when the traditions of Persia, India, and Greece were fused into new and unique forms. The Hephthalite coins, which we have already discussed, are a prime example of this artistic synthesis. The coins often depict the Hephthalite kings in a style that is influenced by Sassanian art, but they also incorporate elements of Indian and Greek artistic traditions. The Hephthalite pottery, which has been found at archaeological sites throughout Central Asia, is also characterized by a distinctive style. The pottery is often decorated with simple geometric patterns, but it sometimes also bears more elaborate designs, including human and animal figures. The Hephthalite metalwork, which includes weapons, tools, and ornaments, is also of high quality. The metalwork often bears intricate designs, and it is a testament to the skill of the Hephthalite craftsmen. The art of the Hephthalite period is a reflection of the cosmopolitan nature of the Hephthalitic Empire. It is an art that draws on a variety of different traditions, and it creates something new and unique. The study of Hephthalite art is an emerging field, and it is likely to yield important new insights into the culture of this enigmatic people. The art of the Hephthalites is a reminder that even the most nomadic of peoples have a rich artistic heritage, and that the desire to create beauty is a universal human trait. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as mere destroyers of civilization, were in fact creators of art and beauty, and their artistic legacy is an important part of the history of Central Asia. The story of the Hephthalites is a story that is still being uncovered, and the art and architecture of the period is a crucial part of this process of discovery. The legacy of the Hephthalites in the modern world is often subtle and indirect, but it is nonetheless significant. The political map of Central Asia, with its complex mix of ethnic groups and competing states, is a product of centuries of migration and conquest, including the Hephthalite invasions. The cultural traditions of the region, including its music, its cuisine, and its social customs, are also a product of this long history. The languages spoken in the region, including Persian, Pashto, and the various Turkic languages, all carry the traces of the peoples who have inhabited the area over the centuries. The Hephthalites, who were one of the many peoples to pass through Central Asia, have left their mark on the region. Their genetic heritage is likely still present in the populations of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Their cultural legacy is evident in the traditions and customs of the region, and their historical memory is preserved in the stories and legends that are told by the people of the area. The Hephthalites are not just a footnote in the history books, they are a part of the living history of Central Asia. The study of the Hephthalites is not just an academic exercise, it is a way of understanding the present by examining the past. The challenges that the region faces today, including ethnic conflict, political instability, and economic underdevelopment, are rooted in the complex history of the area, a history that includes the rise and fall of the Hephthalite Empire. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that the present is always shaped by the past, and that the peoples of the past are still with us, in our genes, in our culture, and in our memories. The Hephthalites, who were once the terror of the East, are now a part of the history of Central Asia, and their story is an essential part of understanding the region and its people. The legacy of the Hephthalites is a complex one, but it is a legacy that is still relevant today. The catastrophic defeat and death of Peroz I at the hands of the Hephthalites in 484 AD was a watershed moment that sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of the Sassanian Empire. News of the disaster traveled along the trade routes, reaching the courts of Byzantium, India, and China. The image of the mighty Persian king, humbled and destroyed by a horde of nomadic warriors, was a stark reminder of the fragility of power. For the Byzantine Empire, the news was greeted with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The Byzantines, who had long been rivals of the Sassanians, were pleased to see their enemy weakened. But they were also concerned about the rise of a new and potentially more dangerous power on their eastern flank. The Hephthalites, who had proven their ability to defeat the Persian army, were now a threat that the Byzantines had to take seriously. The diplomatic cables, so to speak, of the ancient world must have been buzzing with the news of the Persian catastrophe. The balance of power, which had been relatively stable for decades, had been dramatically overturned. The old order, in which the Sassanians and the Byzantines were the two dominant powers, was now challenged by the emergence of the Hephthalite Empire. The news of the death of Peroz was a turning point in the geopolitics of the ancient world. It marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new and more uncertain period. The shockwaves of the disaster were felt in every corner of the known world, from the courts of the great empires to the camps of the nomadic tribes. The death of Peroz was not just a Persian tragedy. It was a world event, an event that changed the course of history. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a reminder that the ancient world was an interconnected system, and that events in one region could have profound and far-reaching consequences. The death of one king on a distant battlefield could alter the balance of power and shape the destiny of nations. The catastrophe of 484 was one of those events, and its impact is still being felt today. The internal political consequences of the Hephthalite victory were equally profound. The Sassanian Empire, which had been a centralized state, was now in danger of fragmentation. The death of the king and the destruction of the army had left a power vacuum, and the great noble families, who had always been a powerful force in Persian politics, were now jockeying for position. The civil war that followed the death of Peroz was a brutal and destructive affair, as different factions fought for control of the throne. The Hephthalites, who were the architects of this chaos, were content to sit back and watch the Persians tear themselves apart. They had already extracted a heavy price from the empire, and they were in no hurry to intervene. The civil war weakened the empire further, and it made it even more vulnerable to external attack. The Hephthalites, who had been the external threat, had now triggered an internal crisis, a crisis that would have lasting consequences for the Sassanian state. The civil war also exposed the deep divisions within Persian society. The nobility, who were supposed to be the pillars of the state, were now fighting among themselves, putting their own interests above the interests of the empire. The common people, who had suffered the most from the wars, were alienated from the ruling class. The social contract that had held the Sassanian state together was breaking down. The Hephthalite victory had not just defeated the Persian army, it had undermined the very foundations of the Sassanian state. The period of civil war that followed was a dark time for Persia, a time of uncertainty and fear. The empire, which had once been a beacon of stability, was now a cauldron of violence and chaos. The story of the aftermath of the Hephthalite victory is a story of internal collapse, of the breakdown of the political order, and of the suffering of the common people. It is a story that is as relevant today as it was 1500 years ago, a story about the dangers of political instability, and the importance of strong and effective government. The economic consequences of the Hephthalite victory were also severe. The tribute payments that the Sassanians were forced to make were a massive drain on the imperial treasury. The gold and silver that flowed eastward to the Hephthalite court was money that could have been used to pay soldiers, build roads, or support the arts. The Hephthalite raids and invasions had also caused widespread destruction. The farms were burned, the villages were looted, and the trade routes were disrupted. The economic infrastructure of the eastern provinces was devastated. The result was a period of economic decline, characterized by inflation, unemployment, and a fall in the standard of living. The economic crisis was particularly severe in the province of Khorasan, which had been the main battleground of the war. The city of Merv, which had been a major center of trade, was sacked and its population decimated. The economic decline contributed to the social unrest that was already brewing. The poor, who were the hardest hit by the crisis, were increasingly resentful of the rich and powerful. The Mazdakite movement, which we have already discussed, was a direct response to this economic inequality. The movement's call for the redistribution of wealth resonated with the poor, and it quickly gained a large following. The economic consequences of the Hephthalite victory were not just a matter of numbers, they were a matter of human suffering. The wars caused untold misery for the people of the eastern provinces, and the economic crisis that followed only added to their woes. The story of the economic consequences of the Hephthalite victory is a story of decline, of the collapse of an economy, and of the suffering of the people. It is a story that is essential to understanding the subsequent history of the Sassanian Empire, a history that was marked by economic instability and social unrest. The economic legacy of the Hephthalite Wars was a long-lasting one, and it played a major role in the decline of the Sassanian state. The religious and ideological consequences of the Hephthalite victory were perhaps the most profound. The Sassanian Empire was a theocracy, a state in which the king was seen as the representative of the gods on earth. The king's authority was based on the divine favor, and his victories were seen as proof of his divine mandate. The defeat and death of Perez was therefore not just a military and political disaster, it was also a religious and ideological crisis. The belief in the invincibility of the king and the divine favor of the Sassanian dynasty was shattered. The people began to question the legitimacy of the ruling house, and they began to look for alternative sources of authority. This ideological crisis created a fertile ground for the growth of new religious movements, such as Mazdakism. Mazdak, who preached a message of radical egalitarianism and social justice, challenged the very foundations of the Sassanian social and religious order. He argued that the inequality and injustice that were so prevalent in Persian society were contrary to the will of God. His teachings, which resonated with the poor and the oppressed, posed a direct threat to the power of the king, the nobility, and the clergy. The ideological crisis of the late 5th century was a direct consequence of the Hephthalite victory. The defeat had exposed the hollowness of the old ideology, and it had created a vacuum that was filled by new and radical ideas. The story of the ideological consequences of the Hephthalite victory is a story of the collapse of a belief system, of the questioning of authority, and of the rise of new ideologies. It is a story that is as relevant today as it was 1500 years ago, a story about the power of ideas to shape the course of history. The Hephthalites, who were the instruments of this ideological crisis, were probably unaware of the profound impact that their victory would have on the religious and philosophical development of Persia. But their victory, by shattering the old certainties, had opened the door to a new era of intellectual ferment, an era that would produce some of the most important religious and philosophical ideas of the ancient world. The story of the Hephthalite victory is a reminder that military defeat can have profound ideological consequences, and that the most important battles are often fought not on the battlefield, but in the minds of men. The strategic lessons of the Hephthalite Wars were not lost on the later Sassanian kings. The disasters suffered by Perez taught them the importance of the eastern frontier, and they learned to treat the nomadic peoples of the steppes with respect. The reforms of Kavad I and Khosrow I, which we have already discussed, were a direct response to the lessons of the Hephthalite Wars. The military reforms created a more professional and more mobile army, capable of fighting the nomadic cavalry on their own terms. The construction of the Great Wall of Gorgan was a response to the strategic challenge of defending the settled lands from the raids of the steppe nomads. The diplomatic alliance with the Turkic Khaganate was a response to the strategic challenge of defeating a powerful nomadic confederation. The later Sassanian kings had learned the lesson that the eastern frontier could not be ignored, and that the threat from the steppes was just as serious as the threat from the west. The strategic lessons of the Hephthalite Wars were applied with great success by Khosrow I, who was able to defeat the Hephthalites and to secure the eastern frontier. The story of the strategic lessons of the Hephthalite Wars is a story of learning from mistakes, of adaptation, and of the development of new strategies and institutions to meet new challenges. It is a story that is as relevant today as it was 1500 years ago, a story about the importance of learning from the past and of adapting to changing circumstances. The Sassanian kings, who were once defeated by the Hephthalites, eventually learned to defeat them, and the lessons they learned were applied for centuries to come. The strategic legacy of the Hephthalite Wars was a lasting one, and it shaped the military and diplomatic policies of the Sassanian Empire until its very end. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a reminder that even the most catastrophic defeats can be turned into opportunities for learning and growth, and that the key to success is the ability to adapt and to innovate. The memory of the Hephthalite Wars was preserved in the Persian historical tradition, and it was used as a cautionary tale for future generations. The Shahnameh, the great epic poem of Persia, recounts the story of the wars in vivid detail, emphasizing the tragic fate of Peroz and the wisdom of Khosrow I. The story of Peroz, the king who was killed by the White Huns, became a symbol of the dangers of pride and overreach. The story of Khosrow, the king who defeated the Hephthalites through wisdom and diplomacy, became a symbol of the virtues of prudence and strategic thinking. The Persian historical tradition used the Hephthalite Wars to teach moral lessons about the nature of kingship and the importance of good government. The memory of the wars also shaped the Persian identity. The Hephthalites, who were a foreign people, were seen as the ultimate other, the barbarians who threatened the civilized world. The struggle against the Hephthalites became a defining moment in the history of the Persian nation, a moment when the Persians had to fight for their very survival. The memory of the wars was also used to justify the military and diplomatic policies of the later Sassanian kings. The kings argued that they needed a strong army and a vigilant foreign policy in order to protect the empire from the threat of the steppe nomads. The story of the Hephthalite Wars was thus not just a historical record. It was also a political tool, used to legitimize the power of the monarchy and to rally the people to the defense of the realm. The memory of the Hephthalite Wars is a reminder that history is not just about the past, it is also about the present. The way we remember the past shapes the way we understand the present and the way we act in the world. The Persians remembered the Hephthalite Wars as a great struggle for survival, and this memory shaped their identity and their politics for centuries to come. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a story about the power of memory, about the way that the past is used to shape the present, and about the enduring legacy of historical trauma. The memory of the White Huns, who terrorized the Persian Empire, lived on long after the Hephthalites themselves had disappeared, and it continued to shape the Persian worldview for generations. The resurgence of the Sassanian Empire under Khosrow I was not just a military recovery, it was a cultural and intellectual renaissance. The reign of Khosrow I Anushirvan was a golden age for Persian literature, philosophy, and science. The king, who was a great patron of learning, welcomed scholars from all over the world to his court. The Academy of Gunshaper, which had been founded centuries earlier, became one of the most important centers of learning in the world. Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac scholars worked together, translating texts and advancing knowledge in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. The game of chess, which had been introduced to Persia during the reign of Khosrow, became a popular pastime at court. The legendary sage Buzurjmir, who was said to be Khosrow's chief minister, was credited with deciphering the game and inventing backgammon. The reign of Khosrow was also a time of great building projects. The king commissioned the construction of magnificent palaces, bridges, and fortifications. The Great Wall of Gorgan, which was built to defend the eastern frontier against the nomads, was one of the most impressive engineering feats of the ancient world. The cultural and intellectual renaissance of Khosrow's reign was a direct response to the crisis of the late 5th century. The Hephthalite Wars had exposed the weaknesses of the old order, and they had created a desire for change and renewal. Khosrow, who was a visionary and a reformer, was able to channel this desire into a program of cultural and intellectual revitalization. The result was a golden age, a period of achievement that would be remembered for centuries. The story of Khosrow's Renaissance is a story of the power of ideas to transform a society. It is a story that is as relevant today as it was 1500 years ago, a story about the importance of education, innovation, and cultural exchange. The reign of Khosrow I was a high point in the history of the Sassanian Empire, and it was a high point that was made possible, in part, by the lessons learned from the Hephthalite Wars. The crisis of the late 5th century had been a tragedy, but it had also been a catalyst for change, and the result was a renaissance that transformed the Persian world. The figure of Buzurjmir, the legendary sage of the Sassanian court, is central to the cultural memory of the Hephthalite era. According to the tradition, Buzurjmir was the chief minister of Khosrow I, and he was the wisest man in the empire. He was a master of many disciplines, including philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. He was also a skilled diplomat and a brilliant strategist. The story of Buzurjmir's encounter with the Indian game of chess is one of the most famous episodes in the Shahnameh. According to the legend, an Indian ambassador arrived at the Sassanian court, bearing a gift of a chess set. The ambassador presented the game to Khosrow I, and he explained that the Indian king had issued a challenge. If the Persians could decipher the rules of the game, the Indian king would acknowledge the superiority of Persian wisdom and continue to pay tribute. But if they could not, the tribute would be demanded from Persia. Buzurjmir, the wisest of the Persian sages, accepted the challenge. He studied the game for days, and he was eventually able to decipher the rules. In response, he invented a new game, backgammon, and he sent it back to the Indian king as a counter-challenge. The Indian sages, who were unable to decipher the rules of backgammon, were forced to admit defeat. The story of Buzurjmir is a myth, but it is a myth that reveals the values of the Sassanian court. It celebrates the virtues of wisdom, learning, and intellectual prowess. It also reveals the importance of games, such as chess and backgammon, in the culture of the Sassanian court. These games were not just pastimes, they were seen as tools of intellectual development and as symbols of cultural sophistication. The story of Buzurjmir is a reminder that the Sassanian Empire was not just a military power, it was also a center of learning and culture. The figure of Buzurjmir, the wise sage, is a symbol of the intellectual achievements of the Sassanian era, and his story is an essential part of the cultural memory of Persia. The legacy of Buzurjmir is a lasting one, and it is a legacy that is still celebrated in Iran today. The Great Wall of Gorgan, which was built during the reign of Khosrow I, is a tangible reminder of the Hephthalite threat. The wall, which stretches for nearly 200 kilometers, was built to defend the settled lands of Khorasan from the raids of the steppe nomads. The construction of the wall was a massive undertaking, requiring the labor of thousands of workers and the resources of the entire empire. The wall is a testament to the engineering skills of the Sassanians, and to their determination to defend their eastern frontier. The wall was not just a physical barrier, it was also a symbol of the Sassanian state's commitment to the defense of its civilization. The wall sent a clear message to the nomads of the steppes: the Sassanian Empire would not be easily conquered. The Great Wall of Gorgan is one of the most impressive monuments of the ancient world, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a reminder of the constant threat posed by the steppe nomads, and of the efforts that the settled empires made to defend themselves. The wall is also a reminder of the scale and the sophistication of the Sassanian state, which was capable of undertaking such a massive engineering project. The Great Wall of Gorgan is a symbol of the Sassanian Empire, a symbol of its power, its wealth, and its determination to defend its civilization. The story of the wall is a story of defense, of engineering, and of the constant struggle between the settled world and the nomadic frontier. It is a story that is as relevant today as it was 1500 years ago. The wall is a monument to the human desire for security, and it is a reminder that the struggle to defend civilization is a constant feature of human history. The Great Wall of Gorgan stands as a silent witness to the terror of the Hephthalites, and to the resilience of the Persian people who built it to keep them at bay. The alliance between Khosrow I and the Turkic Khaganate was a masterstroke of diplomacy, but it was also a gamble. The Turks were an unknown quantity, and there was no guarantee that they would be reliable allies. Khosrow, however, was willing to take the risk, and the risk paid off. The alliance was a success, and it led to the destruction of the Hephthalite Empire. The success of the alliance was a major factor in the recovery of the Sassanian Empire. The destruction of the Hephthalites removed a major threat to the eastern frontier, and it allowed the Sassanians to focus their attention on the west. The alliance with the Turks was a turning point in the history of the Sassanian Empire, and it was a turning point in the history of Central Asia. The destruction of the Hephthalites created a new balance of power, and it paved the way for the rise of the Turkic Khaganate. The alliance between the Sassanians and the Turks was a short-lived one, but it had a lasting impact on the region. The story of the alliance is a reminder that in the world of international politics, there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. There are only permanent interests. The rulers of the ancient world understood this principle well, and they used it to their advantage. The alliance between the Sassanians and the Turks is a perfect example of the application of this principle, and it is a lesson that is still relevant in the world today. The destruction of the Hephthalite Empire was a great victory for Khosrow I, but it was a victory that created new problems. The Turks, who had been allies, soon became rivals, and the Sassanian Empire found itself facing a new threat from the steppes. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a story of shifting alliances, of the constant struggle for power, and of the unintended consequences of even the most successful policies. The destruction of the Hephthalites was a triumph, but it was a triumph that sowed the seeds of future conflicts. The balance of power in Central Asia was always fragile, and the victory over the Hephthalites had simply replaced one threat with another. The Sassanian Empire, which had spent so much effort to secure its eastern frontier, would now have to face a new and even more formidable enemy. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a reminder that the struggle for security is an ongoing process, and that there are no permanent solutions in the world of international politics. The death of Khosrow I in 579 AD marked the end of a golden age for the Sassanian Empire. The empire, which had been so carefully built up by Khosrow and his father, Kavad, began to decline under his successors. The later Sassanian kings, while some were capable, were unable to match the achievements of Khosrow I Anushirvan. The empire was once again plagued by internal strife, by wars with the Byzantines, and by the constant pressure from the steppe nomads. The Turkic Khaganate, which had been the ally of the Sassanians in the war against the Hephthalites, had become a powerful rival. The wars between the Sassanians and the Turks, which lasted for decades, drained the resources of both empires. The Sassanian Empire, which had been at the height of its power under Khosrow I, was now slowly declining. The final blow came in the 7th century, with the rise of the Arab Islamic Caliphate. The Arabs, who were inspired by their new religion and their desire for conquest, swept out of the Arabian Peninsula and quickly overran the weakened Sassanian Empire. The last Sassanian king, Yazdijir III, was defeated and killed in 651 AD, and the empire was incorporated into the Islamic Caliphate. The fall of the Sassanian Empire was a world historical event, and it was an event that was directly connected to the long history of warfare on the eastern frontier. The Hephthalite Wars, which had taken place 2 centuries earlier, had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the destruction of the Sassanian Empire. The wars had weakened the empire, both militarily and economically, and they had created a legacy of instability and conflict that would plague the Sassanian state for the rest of its existence. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is an essential part of the story of the fall of the Sassanian Empire. The terror from the east, which had struck such fear into the hearts of the Persians, had ultimately contributed to the fall of the mightiest empire of the ancient world. The legacy of the Hephthalites is a complex one, but it is a legacy that is an important part of the history of Asia, and it is a legacy that deserves to be remembered. The fall of the Sassanian Empire to the Arabs was a cataclysm that transformed the Middle East. The ancient civilization of Persia, which had been one of the great powers of the world for centuries, was now under the rule of a new, foreign empire. The Zoroastrian religion, which had been the state religion of the Sassanians, was gradually replaced by Islam. The Persian language and culture, however, were not extinguished. The Persians, who were a proud and resilient people, adapted to the new conditions. They converted to Islam, but they retained their language and their cultural identity. The Persian language, which had been the language of the Sassanian court, continued to be spoken and written, and it eventually became the language of a new Persianate civilization that flourished under the Islamic caliphates. The Persian contribution to Islamic civilization was immense. The Persians were the administrators, the scholars, the artists, and the poets of the new Islamic empire. They played a crucial role in the development of Islamic law, theology, philosophy, and science. The cultural and intellectual achievements of the Sassanian era, including the knowledge that had been accumulated at the Academy of Gunshaper, were passed on to the Islamic world, and they formed the foundation of the Golden Age of Islamic civilization. The story of the fall of the Sassanian Empire is not just a story of destruction, it is also a story of transformation. The Persian civilization, which had been so powerful, was not destroyed. It was absorbed into the new Islamic civilization, and it continued to influence the world for centuries to come. The legacy of the Sassanians, including the games of chess and backgammon, the art and architecture, and the scientific and philosophical knowledge, was passed on to the Islamic world, and from there to the wider world. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is an essential part of this larger story. The wars, which had weakened the Sassanian Empire, had also been a catalyst for change, forcing the Persians to reform their state and their army, and ultimately leading to the Golden Age of Khosrow I. The legacy of the Hephthalites is thus a part of the legacy of the Sassanians, a legacy that has shaped the world in profound and lasting ways. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a compelling narrative of rise and fall, of conflict and adaptation, of disaster and recovery. It is a story that is full of dramatic events, larger-than-life personalities, and profound historical significance. The Hephthalites, who emerged from the vastness of the steppes to challenge the great empires of their age, were a force that could not be ignored. Their wars against the Sassanian Empire, which culminated in the catastrophic defeat and death of Peroz I, brought the Persian Empire to the brink of collapse. The disaster of 484 was a turning point in the history of the ancient world, a moment when the balance of power shifted and a new era began. The recovery of the Sassanian Empire, under the leadership of Kavad I and Khosrow I, was a remarkable achievement, a testament to the resilience of the Persian people and the wisdom of their rulers. The reforms of Kavad and Khosrow transformed the Sassanian state, creating a more centralized, more efficient, and more powerful empire. The alliance with the Turkic Khaganate, which led to the destruction of the Hephthalite Empire, was a masterstroke of diplomacy, a brilliant example of the application of the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a story of learning from mistakes, of adaptation, and of the constant struggle for survival. It is a story that is as relevant today as it was 1500 years ago, a story about the challenges of empire, the dangers of overreach, and the importance of good government. The Hephthalite Wars are a reminder that the ancient world was a complex and interconnected system, where events in one region could have profound consequences for regions far away. The death of a king on a distant battlefield could alter the course of history. The Hephthalites, who were once dismissed as mere barbarians, were in fact major players in the history of the ancient world, and their story is an essential part of the tapestry of human history. The Hephthalite Wars also had a profound impact on the development of military strategy and technology. The Sassanians, who had been accustomed to fighting the relatively static armies of the Romans, were forced to adapt to the mobile warfare of the steppe nomads. The reforms of the Sassanian army, which were initiated by Kavad I and Khosrow I, created a more professional and more mobile force, capable of fighting the Hephthalite cavalry on their own terms. The use of the stirrup, which was a crucial innovation in the history of warfare, may have been spread to the west by the Hephthalites. The stirrup allowed a rider to maintain his balance while fighting on horseback, and it was a major factor in the development of heavy cavalry. The Hephthalite Wars also stimulated the development of defensive fortifications, such as the Great Wall of Gorgan, which was built to protect the settled lands from the raids of the steppe nomads. The military lessons of the Hephthalite Wars were applied not only by the Sassanians but also by the Byzantines and later by the Arabs. The struggle against the steppe nomads was a constant feature of the history of the ancient world, and it was a struggle that drove the development of new military technologies and strategies. The Hephthalites, who were the masters of this form of warfare, were a major factor in this process of military innovation. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a story of military adaptation, of the evolution of new ways of fighting, and of the constant struggle to gain an advantage over the enemy. The military legacy of the Hephthalites is a lasting one, and it is a legacy that can be seen in the military traditions of the peoples of Central Asia and the Middle East. The Hephthalites, who were once the terror of the East, were also the catalysts of military innovation, and their impact on the history of warfare is immense. The cultural and intellectual legacy of the Hephthalite era is often overlooked, but it is nonetheless significant. The Hephthalites, who were a nomadic people, were in contact with the great civilizations of their age, and they played a role in the transmission of ideas and technologies between the East and the West. The Hephthalitic Empire was a melting pot of cultures, a place where the traditions of Persia, India, and China came into contact and blended together. The art and architecture of the Hephthalite period, which is evident in the archaeological record, is a testament to this cultural synthesis. The coins of the Hephthalites, which bear symbols and inscriptions from Persian, Indian, and Greek traditions, are a visual record of this cultural fusion. The games of chess and backgammon, which were popular in the Sassanian court, may have been influenced by the Hephthalites. The transmission of these games from the east to the west was facilitated by the cultural contacts that were established during the Hephthalite era. The cultural and intellectual legacy of the Hephthalites is a reminder that even the most violent and destructive conflicts can also be times of cultural exchange and synthesis. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as the enemies of civilization, were also the carriers of ideas and technologies, and their contribution to the development of a shared Eurasian culture is immense. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is not just a story of war and destruction, it is also a story of cultural exchange and intellectual innovation. The Hephthalites, who were once the terror of the East, were also the agents of cultural transmission, and their legacy is a lasting one. The cultural and intellectual history of the Hephthalite era is a rich and complex subject, and it is a subject that is only beginning to be explored by scholars. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that history is not just about battles and kings, it is also about the movement of ideas, the exchange of cultures, and the constant evolution of human civilization. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a reminder of the importance of understanding the nomadic peoples of the steppes. For centuries, the settled civilizations of the ancient world viewed the nomads as savages and barbarians, people who were outside the bounds of civilization. But the nomads were not simply destructive forces. They were also agents of change, who played a crucial role in the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between the East and the West. The nomads were the masters of the Silk Road, the great trade route that connected China to the Mediterranean. They were the ones who transported the silk, the spices, and the other luxury goods that fueled the economies of the ancient world. The nomads were also the conduits for the spread of religions, such as Buddhism and Islam, and for the transmission of scientific and technological knowledge. The nomads were not just raiders and conquerors, they were also merchants, missionaries, and cultural brokers. The Hephthalites were a perfect example of this dual role. They were fierce warriors, who terrorized the great empires of their time. But they were also skilled traders, who controlled the flow of goods across Central Asia. The story of the Hephthalite Wars is a reminder that the history of the ancient world cannot be understood without understanding the nomads. The nomads were an essential part of the ancient world, and their contribution to the history of civilization has been immense. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as the enemies of civilization, are now recognized as one of the many peoples who have contributed to the rich tapestry of human history. The story of the White Huns is a story that deserves to be told and remembered, and it is a story that has much to teach us about the complex and often surprising nature of human history. The enduring fascination with the Hephthalites lies in their mystery. They left no written records of their own, and their story has to be pieced together from the accounts of their enemies and their neighbors. This mystery has led to much speculation and debate among historians. Who were the Hephthalites? Where did they come from? What was their culture like? These are questions that scholars are still trying to answer. The lack of information has allowed the Hephthalites to be romanticized and mythologized. They have been portrayed as both noble savages and brutal barbarians. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. The Hephthalites were a complex and sophisticated people, and their story is far more nuanced than the simple narratives of good versus evil. The enduring fascination with the Hephthalites is a reminder of the power of the unknown. The gaps in our knowledge allow our imaginations to run wild, and they invite us to speculate about the lost world of the steppes. The Hephthalites, who were once the terror of the East, are now the subject of scholarly inquiry and historical fascination. Their story is a reminder that the past is not a closed book, it is a mystery that is still being solved. The study of the Hephthalites is an ongoing process, and new discoveries are constantly being made. The archaeological work in Central Asia is shedding new light on the Hephthalite civilization, and the numismatic evidence is providing new insights into their history and their economy. The future of Hephthalite studies is bright, and the mystery of the White Huns is likely to continue to fascinate and intrigue scholars for generations to come. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts. It is also a story, a narrative that we construct to make sense of the past. And like all good stories, the story of the Hephthalites is full of drama, mystery, and enduring human interest. As we conclude our journey into the world of the Hephthalites, we are left with a profound appreciation for the complexity and the drama of ancient history. The story of the White Huns, who emerged from the steppes to challenge the great empires of their age, is a story that is both tragic and inspiring. It is a story of war and peace, of destruction and creation, of the constant struggle between the settled world and the nomadic frontier. The Hephthalites, who were once the terror of the East, have left a lasting legacy, a legacy that is still being studied and debated by historians. Their wars against the Sassanian Empire, which culminated in the catastrophic defeat of Peroz I, were a turning point in the history of the ancient world. The recovery of the Sassanian Empire, under the leadership of Kavad I and Khosrow I, was a remarkable achievement, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The destruction of the Hephthalite Empire, through the alliance between the Sassanians and the Turks, was a triumph of diplomacy, but it also created new problems. The story of the Hephthalites is a reminder that history is not a simple story of progress. It is a complex and often contradictory narrative, full of surprises and unintended consequences. The terror from the East, which the settled empires so feared, was also a source of innovation and change, a force that helped to shape the world in which we live today. The Hephthalites, who were once seen as the enemies of civilization, are now recognized as one of the many peoples who have contributed to the rich tapestry of human history. Their story is a powerful reminder of the fragility of power, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring importance of understanding the past. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories of our history. Share this video with your friends, and leave a comment below. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.